Preface. Why the Ancients Still Win. There is something uncomfortable about the fact that a Roman emperor who died 1800 years ago understood the human mind better than most of the content produced this morning. That a former slave who owned nothing, who was born into chains, who had no political power, no financial security, no guarantee of tomorrow, left behind a body of wisdom about how to live that the most credentialed psychologists of the 21st century are still catching up to. That a Phoenician merchant who survived a shipwreck, lost everything he had built, and wandered into Athens with nothing but his life, sat down outside a bookshop, read a text about Socrates, and decided that the pursuit of wisdom was worth more than the pursuit of everything he had just lost, and founded, from that decision, a philosophical tradition that has outlasted every empire, every ideology, and every self-help movement that has come since. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Zeno of Citium. They did not have the internet. They did not have neuroscience or cognitive behavioral therapy, or the accumulated research of a century of academic psychology. They did not have the productivity tools, the meditation apps, the carefully optimized morning routines that the modern self-improvement industry sells with such relentless enthusiasm. What they had was something rarer, something that the abundance of modern information, for all its extraordinary reach and its extraordinary convenience, has not managed to produce in greater quantities than the ancient world did. Wisdom. The specific, hard-won, genuinely tested wisdom of people who had thought deeply about the human condition, about suffering and desire and fear and death, and the question of what a good life actually requires, and who had arrived, through that thinking, at principles so grounded in the fundamental reality of human experience that 2,000 years of history have not managed to make them obsolete. This book is an attempt to make those principles available, not as historical curiosity, not as the intellectual property of academic philosophy, but as what the Stoics always intended them to be: practical tools, mental armor, the specific, immediately applicable disciplines of mind and character that allow a human being to navigate a world of genuine chaos with genuine equanimity. And the world is genuinely chaotic, perhaps more so than at any previous point in living memory. The pace of change has never been faster. The volume of information has never been greater. The number of decisions required of ordinary people in an ordinary day has never been higher. The ambient anxiety of modern life, the low-grade, persistent, largely unnamed sense of being perpetually behind, perpetually overwhelmed, perpetually subject to forces too large and too complex to fully understand, is not a personal failing. It is the understandable response of a human nervous system that was not designed for the specific demands of the world it currently inhabits. The Stoics did not live in our world, but they lived in a world of comparable chaos. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire of 60 million people while managing wars on multiple fronts, a devastating plague, political betrayal, and the personal losses that no amount of imperial power could prevent. Epictetus navigated slavery, the complete, institutional removal of personal freedom, and arrived, from within that condition, at a philosophy of inner liberty so complete and so grounded that it has inspired free people for 2,000 years. Seneca navigated wealth and poverty and political persecution and the proximity of death with a quality of equanimity that his letters, still among the most readable documents in the philosophical tradition, communicate across the centuries with remarkable directness. They were not calm because their circumstances were favorable. They were calm because they had built something inside themselves that circumstances could not reliably touch. That is what this book is about. Not the calm that arrives when life cooperates, but the calm that persists when it doesn't. The inner stability, forged through understanding, through practice, through the daily, imperfect, genuinely demanding application of philosophical principles to the actual texture of a lived life, that the Stoics called the inner citadel, the fortress of the self, the one place that no external force, no loss, no failure, no betrayal, no verdict of circumstance can enter without permission. Building that fortress is the work of a lifetime, but it begins with understanding. With the clear, honest, practically grounded account of what the Stoics actually taught, not the caricature, not the superficial summary, not the motivational poster version, but the real thing, in its full depth and its full demand and its full, extraordinary promise. That is what this book is attempting to provide. 12 chapters, 4 parts. A complete, honest, practically oriented guide to the Stoic philosophy, from its foundations to its daily application, written for the person living in the specific, demanding, genuinely chaotic reality of modern life. The ancients still win, not because the past was better than the present, but because the fundamental challenges of being human, the fear, the anger, the desire, the grief, the question of what matters and how to live in accordance with it, have not changed. And the people who thought most carefully about those challenges, who tested their conclusions against the full pressure of genuinely difficult lives, who refined their wisdom not in comfortable libraries, but in the arena of real experience, those people still have something to teach, something that the most sophisticated content of the most connected era in human history has not yet managed to replace. Pull up a chair. Open the door of the inner citadel. The work begins now. Part 1. The Foundation. Building the Inner Citadel. Chapter 1. What the Stoics actually taught. Before any armor can be forged, the metal must be understood. Before any Stoic principle can be genuinely applied, before the dichotomy of control, or the practice of memento mori, or the discipline of perception can do the work they are capable of doing in a real life, the philosophy itself must be clearly seen. Not the version that has been filtered through 2,000 years of misreading. Not the caricature that the word Stoic has become in popular usage, but the actual teaching, in its full complexity, and its full humanity, and its full, demanding, genuinely liberating scope. So let us begin at the beginning, with what Stoicism actually is. Stoicism was founded in Athens, around 300 BCE, by a man named Zeno of Citium. Zeno was a Phoenician merchant, a man of commerce, of practical intelligence, of the kind of worldly competence that builds trading enterprises and navigates the complexities of Mediterranean commerce. He was not, by origin, a philosopher. He became one through accident and through the specific quality of mind that recognizes, in an accident, an invitation. The accident was a shipwreck. Zeno lost his cargo, his livelihood, and the material foundation of the life he had been building. He arrived in Athens with nothing, and in Athens, wandering, displaced, without the commercial identity that had previously organized his sense of self. He walked into a bookshop and picked up a text about Socrates. What he read changed the direction of his life entirely. The Socratic account of philosophy, not as abstract speculation, but as the urgent, practical, daily inquiry into how to live well, spoke to something in Zeno that the merchant's life had not. He sought out philosophers, he studied, he synthesized, and eventually, teaching in the painted porch, the Stoa Poikile, from which the philosophy takes its name, he began to articulate a framework that would outlast everything he had lost in the shipwreck by approximately 24 centuries. What did he teach? And what did the philosophers who followed him, Chrysippus, who systematized the philosophy, Cicero, who brought it to Rome, Seneca, who made it literature, Epictetus, who made it biography, Marcus Aurelius, who made it governance, add to and refine? The core of Stoic philosophy rests on three foundational pillars. Understanding them clearly, not just as abstract ideas, but as practical orientations toward daily life, is the prerequisite for everything that follows in this book. The first pillar is the distinction between what is within our control and what is not. This is the idea we will explore in full depth in the next chapter, but it is worth naming here as the structural foundation of the entire Stoic project. The Stoics drew a clear, firm, philosophically precise line between the inner world, the domain of judgment, of choice, of voluntary action, and the outer world, the domain of circumstance, of other people's behavior, of the body's health, of reputation, of outcomes. The inner world is ours. The outer world is not. And the confusion of these two domains, the treatment of outer things as though they were inner ones, the investment of our peace and our identity in things that circumstances can take away, is, in the Stoic analysis, the primary source of human suffering. The second pillar is the primacy of virtue. The Stoics made a claim that is both radical and, the more you sit with it, genuinely liberating. Virtue, the specific, practical daily expression of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, is the only true good. Not health, not wealth, not reputation, not pleasure, not even life itself. These things are what the Stoics called preferred indifference. Things that are reasonable to pursue and reasonable to prefer, but whose presence or absence does not determine the quality of a human life at its deepest level. Only virtue does that. Only the quality of your character, the consistency, and the integrity of your choices constitutes genuine well-being. This is not asceticism. The Stoics did not teach that wealth is evil or that pleasure is to be avoided. They taught that making your peace contingent on their presence is the error. That the person who can enjoy wealth without needing it, who can experience pleasure without being governed by it, who can pursue success without making their integrity contingent on achieving it, this person is genuinely free in a way that the person who has more, but needs it more, is not. The third pillar is the unity of theory and practice. The Stoics were, above all else, practitioners. They were not interested in philosophy as a set of propositions to be intellectually admired. They were interested in philosophy as a way of living, as a set of disciplines, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, to be applied imperfectly and persistently to the actual texture of each ordinary day. Marcus Aurelius did not write his meditations for publication. He wrote them as a private journal, a record of his ongoing, often struggling, never completed effort to live according to his own highest standards. The entries are not triumphant. They are not the confident pronouncements of someone who has mastered the philosophy and is sharing his success. They are the private notes of someone working, someone who woke up each morning and had to choose, again, to be the person he was trying to become. Someone who failed regularly and returned to the work the following morning without the self-condemnation that failure often produces. This is one of the most important things to understand about Stoicism before anything else. It is not a destination, it is a practice, a daily, imperfect, never finished engagement with the question of how to live well. The Stoic sage, the perfectly wise person who has fully internalized all the philosophy's principles and applies them without failure, was acknowledged by the Stoics themselves to be a theoretical ideal, an aspiration rather than a description of anyone who actually existed. What actually exists, what the philosophy is actually designed for, is the person who is trying, who understands the principles, who is genuinely committed to applying them, who falls short regularly and returns to the work anyway. This is the Stoic life. Not the perfect expression of the philosophy, but the persistent, honest, genuinely engaged pursuit of it. Stoicism has also been consistently misread as a philosophy of emotional suppression. The Stoic, in popular imagination, is the person who feels nothing, who endures difficulty without complaint because they have successfully divorced themselves from the emotional life that makes difficulty painful. This is a fundamental misreading. The Stoics felt deeply. Marcus Aurelius grieved the deaths of his children with genuine anguish. Epictetus wrote about love and friendship with evident warmth. Seneca's letters are among the most emotionally alive documents in the ancient world, full of tenderness, of humor, of the specific textures of genuine human feeling. What the Stoics were working against was not emotion itself, but what they called the passions, the violent, reason-overthrowing emotional states that arise when the mind makes false judgments about what is truly good or truly bad. The rage that arises when we judge an insult as genuinely harmful to our well-being. The despair that arrives when we judge a loss as genuinely catastrophic. The anxiety that consumes when we judge an uncertain future as genuinely threatening. Each of these passions contains a cognitive error, a false assessment of what actually matters. And the Stoic practice, the daily, patient, imperfect work of examining our judgments and correcting the false ones, gradually transforms the emotional landscape, not toward numbness, toward what the Stoics called eupatheia, the good passions, joy rather than pleasure, caution rather than fear, wishing rather than craving. The emotions of a person whose responses are aligned with their values, rather than driven by the unchecked reactions of the undisciplined mind. This distinction between the suppression of emotion and the maturation of it is one of the most important things in the entire Stoic tradition, and one of the most consistently lost in the popular understanding of what Stoicism teaches. There is also a social dimension to Stoicism that is frequently overlooked. The Stoics were not individualists in the modern sense. They did not teach the cultivation of personal equanimity as an end in itself. They taught it as the foundation of genuine service, of the capacity to contribute to the common good with the full force of a well-ordered character, rather than the diminished, reactive, emotionally consumed contribution of someone whose inner life is in disorder. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire. Cato fought for the Roman Republic. Seneca advised an emperor. Epictetus taught students who went on to lives of genuine public contribution. The Stoic life was not a retreat from the world. It was the development of the inner resources that allowed genuine engagement with the world, its demands, its injustices, its extraordinary complexity, without being destroyed by it. This is what the Stoics actually taught, not the suppression of feeling, not the indifference to outcome, not the cold, affectless endurance of difficulty that the popular caricature suggests, but the development, through understanding, through practice, through the patient, daily engagement with the question of how to live well, of a character so grounded in genuine values, so clear in its perception, so steady in its response to the full range of what life presents, that it constitutes a genuine fortress, a real and durable inner stability that does not depend on circumstances being favorable. That is the armor this book is forging, chapter by chapter, principle by principle, practice by practice. The metal, now understood, is ready to be worked. Chapter 2. The Dichotomy of Control. There's a single idea in the entire history of philosophy that, when genuinely understood, not just intellectually grasped but deeply, practically, viscerally internalized, has the power to dissolve more human suffering than almost any other insight available. It is not a complicated idea. It can be stated in a single sentence. Epictetus states it at the very opening of his Enchiridion, the handbook of Stoic practice that his student Arian compiled from his teachings, as though he understood that everything else he had to say depended on this being heard first. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. That is the idea in its entirety. The dichotomy of control, the precise, philosophically rigorous division of all things into two categories, the things that are genuinely ours and the things that are not, is the foundation on which the entire Stoic edifice rests. Remove it, and the rest of the philosophy has nothing to stand on. Understand it fully, and the rest of the philosophy follows with a kind of natural necessity. But understanding it fully, and this is where most people who encounter the idea stop short, requires going significantly deeper than the surface formulation suggests. Because the dichotomy of control is not just the common sense observation that some things are outside our influence. Everyone knows that. The weather, the behavior of other people, the outcomes of elections and markets and medical diagnoses. The ordinary understanding of human limitation is aware of all of these. What makes the Stoic formulation extraordinary is its precision, its specificity about exactly where the line falls, and its radical, initially counterintuitive claim about how much of what we habitually treat as ours, how much of what we organize our peace and our identity and our sense of well-being around, actually falls on the wrong side of the line. Let us be specific about what Epictetus places within our control. Our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our voluntary actions, the domain of what the Stoics called the prohairesis, the faculty of deliberate choice, the part of us that evaluates, that decides, that chooses how to respond to what life presents. This, and only this, is genuinely, completely, unconditionally ours. No external force can enter this domain without our permission. No circumstance, however dire, can compel a specific judgment, a specific desire, a specific voluntary response. This domain is inviolable. And what falls outside our control? Everything else. The body, its health, its appearance, its vulnerability to illness and injury, and the inevitable deterioration of age. Reputation, what other people think of us, how we are perceived, the judgments others form about our worth and our character. Wealth, its presence, its absence, its sudden departure. The behavior of other people, their kindness or their cruelty, their cooperation or their opposition, their love or their indifference. The outcomes of our actions, however carefully planned, however diligently executed, the results that our efforts produce in the external world. All of these, the body, reputation, wealth, others' behavior, outcomes, are outside our control, not entirely outside our influence. We can take reasonable care of the body without being able to guarantee its health. We can behave honorably without being able to control others' perception of us. We can work diligently without being able to guarantee specific outcomes. The influence is real. The control is not. And this distinction between influence and control is the precise place where most human suffering originates. We treat the things we can influence as though we control them. We invest our peace in outcomes we cannot guarantee. We organize our sense of self around the maintenance of things, health, reputation, the approval of specific people, the achievement of specific goals, that circumstances can always, at any moment, take away. And when they do, as they inevitably will, because they are genuinely outside our control, we are devastated. Not just disappointed, devastated, as though something that was ours has been taken, when in reality what was taken was never ours to begin with. Epictetus understood this with the clarity of someone who had experienced the ultimate removal of external control. As a slave, whose body was legally owned by another person, whose movements were subject to another's will, whose physical safety depended entirely on the temperament and the mood of someone with absolute power over him, he had no illusions about the reliability of external goods. He could not afford them. What he discovered in the specific crucible of that condition was something that free people, surrounded by the comfortable illusion that their external goods are secure, rarely have the occasion to discover so clearly, that the inner domain, the prohairesis, the faculty of deliberate choice, remained his, completely, regardless of what his master did or did not do, regardless of what his circumstances permitted or denied. The judgment he formed about his situation, the values he chose to hold, the character he decided to express within the constraints of his condition, these were inviolably his. And the person who understands that this domain is inviolable, who has genuinely internalized the distinction between what is theirs and what is not, is free in a sense that no external condition can touch. This is what Epictetus meant when he said that some things are up to us and some are not. He was not making a philosophical observation about determinism or free will. He was offering a practical instruction about where to place your investment, about what to care about in the specific way that makes your peace contingent on it, about where the genuine self lives and where it does not. Now, and this is the part of the dichotomy that most modern readers find most demanding, the practical application. The Stoic practice of the dichotomy of control is not the passive acceptance of whatever happens. It is not the resignation of someone who has decided that effort is pointless because outcomes are uncertain. The Stoic works, plans, pursues goals with genuine commitment and genuine energy. But they work and plan and pursue from a specific inner posture. one that is genuinely different from the posture of someone who has made their peace contingent on the outcome. The Stoic gives the full measure of their effort to the things within their control, the quality of their preparation, the integrity of their action, the clarity of their judgment, and releases, with genuine equanimity, rather than performed acceptance, the outcome that their effort produces. Not because outcomes don't matter, but because the alternative, the investment of peace in outcomes that circumstances control, is a form of suffering that no amount of success can permanently resolve. Marcus Aurelius returned to this principle in his private journals with the consistency of someone who found it both essential and genuinely difficult to maintain. He was governing an empire, a role in which outcomes mattered enormously, in which decisions had consequences measured in thousands of lives. And yet he returned daily to the reminder that his domain was the quality of his governance, the wisdom of his judgments, the integrity of his decisions, the genuine effort of his preparation, not the outcomes those efforts produced in a world that was always partly beyond his control. He wrote about difficult people, senators who opposed him, generals who failed him, advisors who misled him, with the specific Stoic instruction to remember that their behavior was outside his control, that his response to their behavior was not, that the energy spent in resentment toward what was genuinely outside his domain was energy taken from what was genuinely within it. This is the daily practice of the dichotomy, the ongoing, imperfect, genuinely demanding work of noticing, in the moment of frustration, of anxiety, of the specific distress that arrives when things are not going the way we wanted, where the distress is actually located, whether it is arising from something within our control that we have neglected, or from something outside our control that we have mistakenly treated as ours. The frustration with the traffic jam. Is this within your control? The traffic is not. Your response to the traffic, the judgment you form about it, the emotional state you maintain within it, the use you make of the time it creates, is entirely within your control. The anxiety about the job interview. The interview itself, the questions asked, the panel's existing preferences, the competition from other candidates, is outside your control. The quality of your preparation, the authenticity of your answers, the genuine engagement you bring to the conversation is entirely within it. The grief of a significant loss, the loss itself, the death, the ending, the departure of what was valued is outside your control. The meaning you assign to it, the values you choose to carry forward from it, the person you decide to become in its aftermath is entirely within it. This does not make the traffic jam less annoying, the interview less nerve-wracking, or the loss less painful. The Stoics never pretended otherwise. What it does, over time, with practice, with the patient application of the distinction to the specific, recurring, ordinary and extraordinary challenges of an actual life, is shift the relationship between inner state and outer circumstance. Gradually, and then more rapidly, imperfectly and then more reliably, until the distress that previously arrived automatically, reflexively, without examination, from the simple fact of things not going as planned, begins to arrive with a question attached. Is this within my control? And until that question, asked honestly, answered honestly, and acted on consistently, begins to produce the specific, durable, genuinely earned equanimity that the Stoics spent their lives pursuing. There is a final dimension of the dichotomy that is worth dwelling on. because it is the one most often missed in the practical application of the principle. The Stoics did not teach the dichotomy as a means of not caring. The person who has genuinely internalized the distinction between what is theirs and what is not does not become indifferent to the world. They become more genuinely engaged with it. Because the energy previously consumed by the anxiety of trying to control what cannot be controlled, the exhausting, perpetually failing project of making external circumstances conform to internal preferences, is now available for the genuine work of the inner domain. The full, focused, undivided attention to the quality of judgment, to the integrity of action, to the genuine effort of preparation, to the authentic expression of the values that constitute a good character. These are the things that are genuinely ours. And the person who has released the false goods, who has stopped investing their peace in what circumstances control, brings to the genuine goods a quality of attention and a quality of commitment that the distracted, anxiety-consumed, outcome-dependent person simply cannot match. The dichotomy of control is not a consolation prize for people who have given up on getting what they want. It is the most sophisticated and the most practically effective framework for genuine achievement available, because it redirects the full force of human effort and human attention toward the domain where effort and attention actually produce results. Not the outcomes. The character that produces outcomes. Not the circumstances. The response to circumstances that determines what they mean and what they make possible. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. Know which is which. Invest accordingly. Everything else, the equanimity, the effectiveness, the genuine freedom that the Stoics spent their lives demonstrating is available to any human being willing to do the work, follows from that single, clear, endlessly applicable distinction. Chapter 3. The Examined Life. Socrates said it first, and the Stoics, who inherited much of their philosophical DNA from the Socratic tradition, never stopped saying it. The unexamined life is not worth living. It is one of the most quoted lines in the history of philosophy, and one of the most consistently misunderstood, because the popular reading of it treats it as an intellectual provocation, the challenge of a philosopher to think more deeply, to question more rigorously, to engage with the great ideas, rather than sleepwalking through the ordinary concerns of daily existence. That reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the examined life that Socrates was advocating, and that the Stoics made the daily practice at the center of their philosophical project, is not primarily an intellectual exercise. It is a moral one, a practical one, the specific, demanding, deeply personal work of knowing yourself, of understanding, with genuine honesty and genuine precision, who you actually are, what you actually value, what you actually fear, what actually drives your behavior beneath the story you tell yourself and others about your motivations. Most people never do this work, not because they are incapable of it, not because the tools are unavailable or the time is insufficient, but because genuine self-knowledge is uncomfortable in a way that most people, given the choice, will consistently avoid. It is uncomfortable because what it reveals is not always what we hoped. The value we thought we held most deeply turns out to be less central than the fear we thought we had overcome. The generosity we attributed to genuine care turns out to contain a significant measure of the need for approval. The confidence we projected to the world turns out to rest on a foundation more fragile than the projection suggested. The anger we directed outward turns out to have an inner source we preferred not to examine. Self-knowledge, pursued honestly, does not confirm the self-image. It complicates it. And the complication, however uncomfortable in the initial encounter, is the beginning of genuine growth in a way that the comfortable, unexamined self-image can never be. The Stoics understood this, and they built the practice of self-examination into the daily structure of the philosophical life with a thoroughness that reveals how seriously they took it. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations as an act of self-examination. Every entry, however brief, however fragmentary, was the emperor turning the philosophical lens on himself, not on his subjects, not on his enemies, not on the philosophical questions of the academy, on himself, on the specific, personal daily gap between the person he was trying to be and the person his behavior that day had revealed him to be. The entries are remarkable for their honesty. He writes about his own impatience, his tendency to be irritated by the incompetence and the pettiness of the people around him. He writes about his own vanity, the subtle but persistent desire for recognition that he kept having to remind himself was an external good outside his control. He writes about his own grief, the losses that the Stoic framework told him should not disturb his equanimity, but that disturbed it anyway. He does not write about these things with the triumphant clarity of someone who has overcome them. He writes about them with the honest, slightly frustrated, genuinely self-aware recognition of someone who is not, who is still working, who will still be working tomorrow. This quality of honest self-examination, this willingness to look at what is actually there, rather than what one wishes were there, is the foundation of the examined life. And it requires, before anything else, the development of what the Stoics called the observer self, the part of consciousness that can step back from the immediate experience, from the emotion, the impulse, the habitual response, and observe it with something approaching genuine objectivity. This is not as natural as it sounds. The default mode of human consciousness is not observation, it is identification. We do not typically watch our anger from a distance. We become it. We do not observe our fear with curious detachment. We inhabit it completely. The thought and the thinker, the feeling and the feeler, collapse into one, and from inside that collapse, the honest examination of what is happening is simply not available. The Stoic practice of self-examination begins with the cultivation of this observer capacity, the ability to notice, in the moment, or shortly after it, what is actually occurring in the inner life. What thought just arose? What emotion just arrived? What impulse just presented itself as the obvious, natural, practically irresistible response to the situation? And then, crucially, to ask the question that the unexamined life never asks. Is this response mine? Does it reflect the values I actually hold? Is it the response of the person I am genuinely trying to be? Or the response of the habitual self, the conditioned self? The self that was formed by early experience and has been running on autopilot ever since. Epictetus taught this practice with a directness that his students found both clarifying and demanding. He called it the discipline of assent, the practice of pausing in the moment between impression and response, to examine the impression before acting on it, to ask whether the thing that feels urgently, obviously, compellingly true, The insult that seems genuinely threatening, the setback that seems genuinely catastrophic, the desire that seems genuinely necessary, is actually what it presents itself as being. Most of the time, he argued, it is not. The impression is not the reality. The feeling of catastrophe is not the catastrophe itself. The sense of urgent need is not the same as genuine need. And the discipline of assent, the practiced habit of examining the impression before accepting it, is the specific cognitive tool that creates the space in which genuine choice becomes possible. Without it, without the pause, without the examination, without the honest assessment of what is actually happening, rather than what the habitual self immediately interprets as happening, there is no genuine choice. There is only reaction. The automatic, conditioned, largely unconscious response of a self that has never been examined and therefore cannot be directed. The examined life begins in the morning. Marcus Aurelius began each day with a form of philosophical preparation, a deliberate engagement with the day ahead and the challenges it was likely to present. He would anticipate the difficult people, the frustrating circumstances, the events outside his control that would tempt him toward the unchecked reactions that his philosophical commitments identified as errors. He would remind himself, before the day began, of the principles he was committed to applying within it. This is not positive thinking. It is not the manufacture of an optimistic mood to be carried through the challenges of the day. It is the deliberate, philosophically grounded preparation of a mind that knows what it values, knows what it is likely to face, and chooses, before the heat of the moment arrives, how it intends to respond. The examined life also requires the evening. Seneca wrote about the practice of daily review, the examination, before sleep, of how the day was actually lived. Not the performance of the day, not the version that was presented to colleagues and family, and the social world, but the actual inner reality, the moments of genuine alignment between values and behavior, and the moments, more numerous in most days than the honest self prefers to acknowledge, of genuine misalignment. He recommended 3 questions. Where did I go wrong today? Where did I do well? What could I do better tomorrow? Not as self-flagellation, not as the extraction of maximum guilt from the day's failures, but as the honest, practical, genuinely useful accounting that allows the gap between the actual self and the intended self to be seen clearly, and therefore to be gradually, incrementally, imperfectly closed. The evening review is one of the most powerful practices in the entire Stoic toolkit, and one of the most consistently underused because it requires the specific discomfort of honest self-assessment at the end of a day when what the tired mind most wants is not honest assessment, but rest. But the person who resists that desire, who takes 10 minutes before sleep to examine the day with genuine honesty, is doing something that the person who skips it is not. They are building the self-knowledge that makes genuine change possible, accumulating, night by night, an increasingly accurate understanding of their own patterns, their specific triggers, their characteristic failures, their particular forms of the gap between aspiration and behavior that the unexamined life can never provide. There is also a social dimension to the examined life that the Stoics addressed with particular care. The people we surround ourselves with are mirrors, not always accurate ones. The flattering mirror of those who tell us what we want to hear is the most dangerous kind, but mirrors nonetheless. The person who pays attention to how they feel in different relationships, who notices what different people bring out in them, who examines honestly what their behavior in different social contexts reveals about their actual values rather than their stated ones. This person is using their relationships as instruments of self-knowledge. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the people who irritated him, the petty, the vain, the self-serving, the incompetent, and about the Stoic instruction to use those irritations as opportunities for self-examination rather than occasions for judgment. Because the specific quality of another person's behavior that most reliably produces a strong reaction in us is almost always the quality that most directly engages our own unexamined material. The vanity that infuriates is often the vanity we most fear in ourselves. The dishonesty that disgusts is often the dishonesty we have not yet fully acknowledged in our own behavior. The weakness that produces contempt is often the weakness we are most invested in not seeing in the mirror. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is a consistently useful one. The person who can use their reactions to others, not as evidence of others' failings, but as data about their own inner life, is practicing a form of self-examination that is both more honest and more practically useful than the version that keeps all the scrutiny pointed outward. The examined life, practiced consistently, produces something that no amount of external achievement can manufacture. Genuine self-knowledge, the accurate, honest, practically grounded understanding of who you actually are, your specific strengths and your specific limitations, your genuine values and your genuine fears, the specific ways in which your habitual self falls short of your intended self, and the specific practices that are gradually closing that gap. This self-knowledge is not comfortable to acquire. It requires the daily willingness to look honestly at what is there rather than what is wished for, to examine the impression before accepting it, to review the day honestly before sleeping, to use the reactions that others produce as data about the self rather than verdicts about them. But the person who has it, who has built, through years of patient self-examination, a genuinely accurate model of their own inner life, is a person equipped for the rest of what this book has to offer, because the armor that the subsequent chapters will forge, against anxiety, against anger, against fear, against distraction, can only be fitted to a self that is genuinely known. Know yourself, not the version you present to the world, not the version that feels comfortable to contemplate, the actual version, with its specific patterns, its specific gaps, its specific and genuine potential for the growth that honest examination makes possible. That knowledge is the foundation of everything, the first and most essential piece of the armor. Without it, the rest cannot be properly worn. Part 2. The Armor, Forging Your Mental Defenses. Chapter 4. Against Anxiety. Not as a clinical category, not as the specific, diagnosable condition that affects a significant and growing percentage of the modern population and that genuine mental health professionals are trained to treat, but as the broader, more pervasive, more universally human experience of the anxious orientation toward life. The chronic, low-grade, largely unnamed sense of unease that characterizes the inner life of an enormous number of people who would not describe themselves as anxious, who function well, who appear composed, who navigate the demands of daily life with apparent competence, but who carry, beneath the surface of that competence, a persistent hum of worry, that never fully quiets. This is the anxiety that the Stoics addressed. And their address of it, 2,000 years before the neuroscience, before the cognitive behavioral therapy, before the entire apparatus of modern mental health that has grown up around this specific form of human suffering, is both more precise and more practically effective than most people who have not encountered it would expect. Anxiety, in the Stoic analysis, is not a feeling that arrives from outside. It is not produced by the circumstances themselves, the uncertainty, the risk, the genuine complexity of a world that does not always cooperate with our preferences. It is produced by a specific, identifiable, correctable cognitive error. The error of treating uncertain future events as though they were certain present realities, of living, emotionally, in a future that has not arrived, and may never arrive in the form imagined, rather than in the present moment that is the only one actually available. Seneca addressed this with characteristic directness. He observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, that the anticipated catastrophe, the job loss, the health diagnosis, the relationship ending, the financial disaster, is almost always, in the imagination's rendering of it, worse than the actual event would be. Because imagination is not constrained by reality. It can make the anticipated suffering as extensive, as total, as unrelenting as the anxious mind's worst projections require. And reality, which always contains specific limits, specific compensations, specific unexpected resources, cannot compete with the imagination's capacity for catastrophe. This is not to minimize genuine risk. The Stoics were realists. They did not teach that bad things do not happen, or that the feared outcome never arrives. They taught that the suffering produced by the anticipation of bad things is almost always disproportionate to the suffering the actual event would produce, and that the energy consumed by that anticipatory suffering, the years of worry invested in futures that may never materialize in the form feared, is the most wasteful expenditure available to a human life. Seneca wrote, in one of his most quoted passages, about the practice of examining feared futures directly, of sitting with the specific thing you most fear, the specific loss, the specific failure, the specific catastrophe that anxiety is generating, and asking honestly what the actual worst case looks like, not the imagined worst case, inflated by the anxious mind's unchecked projection. The actual worst case, the specific, bounded, real-world consequence of the thing you fear most. This practice, which the Stoics called premeditation malorum, the premeditation of evils, is one of the most counterintuitive and most consistently effective tools in the Stoic arsenal, because it does exactly the opposite of what the anxious mind's instinct recommends. The anxious mind wants to avoid the feared thought, to push it away, to distract from it, to fill the space it occupies with activity or entertainment or the company of others, anything that prevents the direct encounter with what is feared. The Stoic practice moves directly toward it, sits with it, examines it, asks what it actually is, stripped of the imagination's embellishments, stripped of the catastrophizing that anxiety automatically applies, stripped down to its actual, real-world dimensions. And what is almost always found in that direct examination is something more manageable than the anxiety suggested. Not easy, not comfortable, not something to be desired, but survivable, navigable. Something that the human being who has dealt with difficulty before, which is every human being who has reached adulthood, has the resources to meet. Marcus Aurelius practiced this regularly. In his journals, he would examine the specific fears that his circumstances generated: the fear of military defeat, of political betrayal, of the plague that was killing his subjects, of his own death, and apply to each of them the specific Stoic analysis that reduced them from imagined catastrophes to actual challenges. Serious, genuine, demanding challenges, but challenges of a specific, bounded, real-world nature rather than the unlimited, overwhelming, existential disasters that the unexamined fear presented them as. He also applied the dichotomy of control directly to anxiety, and this application is one of the most immediately useful tools in the entire Stoic framework. Because anxiety is almost always anxiety about something outside our control. The job interview outcome, the medical test result, the decision that another person will make, the direction that circumstances beyond our influence will take. The Stoic examination of anxiety asks the simple, clarifying question: is this within my control? If yes, then the anxiety is the misallocation of energy that belongs to the preparation. Stop worrying about the outcome and direct all available energy to the quality of the effort within your control. If no, then the anxiety is the investment of peace in something that is genuinely not yours. And the Stoic instruction, however difficult in practice, is unambiguous. Release it, not through force of will, through the genuine recognition that holding it serves nothing, that the outcome will be what it will be, regardless of the quality of the worry invested in it. This is the cognitive reorientation that the Stoic practice of the dichotomy offers as the antidote to anxiety. Not the suppression of the anxious feeling, not the performance of confidence that the feeling is not present, but the honest examination of what the anxiety is actually about, and the recognition that its object is almost always something that worry cannot change. The Stoics also address the role of the present moment in the management of anxiety, and here their teaching anticipates, with remarkable precision, what modern mindfulness-based approaches to anxiety reduction have since confirmed through extensive clinical research. Anxiety, as a temporal phenomenon, is almost exclusively future-oriented. It is not the present moment that produces it. The present moment, experienced directly, is almost always more manageable than the anticipated future that anxiety projects. It is the mind's departure from the present into the imagined future that generates the suffering. The projection forward, the what if, the when it happens, the I won't be able to cope, that removes consciousness from the actual, present, manageable reality and relocates it in the imagined, future, catastrophized one. The Stoic return to the present, the practice of anchoring consciousness in what is actually, currently, really happening, rather than in the imagined future that anxiety generates, is not just a mindfulness technique. It is a philosophical commitment, the recognition that the present moment is the only one that is genuinely real, that the future, however probable, however well-founded the prediction, does not yet exist, and that the suffering produced by inhabiting it in imagination is suffering produced by nothing, by a reality that is not yet here and may never arrive in the form feared. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with characteristic self-honesty. He noted his own tendency, despite the philosophical commitments of a lifetime, to be pulled into anxious anticipation of futures that had not yet arrived. And he returned, repeatedly, to the same instruction. Confine yourself to the present. The past is gone. The future is not yet here. The present moment is the only domain of genuine reality, and it is almost always, examined directly, more manageable than either memory or anticipation suggests. There is also a social dimension to Stoic anxiety management that deserves attention. A significant proportion of modern anxiety is social anxiety, the specific, consuming worry about how we are perceived, about what others think of us, about the verdict that the social world is forming about our worth, our competence, our likability, our right to occupy the space we are occupying. The Stoic framework addresses this with the directness of the dichotomy. Other people's opinions are outside our control. What they think of us, however much it matters emotionally, however real its consequences in specific practical domains, is not within our power to determine. We can behave honorably. We can communicate genuinely. We can bring the best of ourselves to every interaction. But we cannot control the judgment that forms in another person's mind. And the investment of peace in that judgment, the organization of behavior around the management of others' perceptions, is the investment of peace in something that is genuinely, structurally, irreversibly outside our domain. This does not mean that others' opinions are irrelevant. It means that they belong in the category of preferred indifference, things that are reasonable to consider and reasonable to prefer, but not things whose presence or absence should determine the quality of inner life. The person who has genuinely internalized this, who has genuinely released the need for others' approval as a condition of their own equanimity, experiences a specific and profound liberation. Not the liberation of indifference to how they affect others, but the liberation of someone whose inner stability no longer depends on the social weather. Epictetus was particularly direct about this. He taught that the concern with others' opinions was one of the primary sources of unnecessary suffering, and one of the most common forms of the fundamental Stoic error, the treatment of an external good as though it were an internal one, the investment of the prohairesis, the inner citadel, in something that belongs to the outer world and is therefore always at risk. The Stoic cure for social anxiety is not the cultivation of indifference to others. It is the cultivation of a self-evaluation that is grounded in genuine values, rather than in the mirror of others' perceptions. The question shifts from, what do they think of me, to am I behaving in accordance with what I actually value? And the answer to that question, available through the honest self-examination explored in the previous chapter, is something that no one else's opinion can either confirm or deny. The modern world is, in many respects, an anxiety-producing machine. The volume of information, the pace of change, the constant visibility of others' curated best versions, the ambient uncertainty of economic and political and environmental conditions that exceed any individual's capacity to fully understand or influence. All of these create the specific conditions under which the anxious orientation toward life is not just understandable, but, in the absence of the right philosophical tools, almost inevitable. The Stoics did not have the internet. They did not have the 24-hour news cycle, or the social media feed, or the perpetual comparative exposure to the highlight reels of other lives. But they had war, plague, political instability, economic uncertainty, personal loss, and the full range of the human condition's capacity for genuine difficulty. And they developed, in response to that difficulty, a set of tools for the management of anxiety that the specifics of modern life have not managed to make obsolete. The anxiety is not the enemy. It is a signal, often a useful one, that something in the inner life requires attention. The question is, what kind of attention? The anxious rumination that circles without resolution, or the honest, stoic examination that identifies what is within control and directs full energy toward it? That identifies what is outside control and genuinely, practically releases it. That returns, again and again, with the patience and the practice that genuine change requires, to the present moment that is the only available domain of actual life. The armor against anxiety is not the elimination of uncertainty. Uncertainty is permanent. It is the permanent feature of a life lived in a world that is genuinely, irreducibly complex. The armor is the relationship with uncertainty. The cultivated, philosophically grounded, daily practice capacity to inhabit uncertainty without being consumed by it. To remain present, to remain functional, to remain genuinely engaged with what is actually within reach, while the things outside reach remain, with genuine equanimity outside reach. That is the Stoic cure, not comfort, capability, not the removal of the storm, the inner stability that the storm cannot reach. Chapter 5. Against Anger. Of all the emotions that the Stoics examined with philosophical precision, and they examined all of them, none received more sustained, more detailed, more practically urgent attention than anger. Not because anger is the most common of the passions, not because it is the most psychologically complex, but because it is, in the Stoic assessment, the most immediately destructive. The emotion that, more than any other, burns down in minutes what takes years to build. That produces, in its unchecked expression, consequences so disproportionate to the provocation that generated it that the person who has experienced its aftermath, the damaged relationship, the professional consequence, the spoken word that cannot be unspoken, almost always finds in the cold clarity of retrospect that nothing that was said or done in the heat of anger was worth what it cost. Seneca wrote an entire treatise on anger. 3 books, De Ira, on anger. It is one of the most thorough, most psychologically sophisticated, and most immediately applicable documents in the entire Stoic canon. And it begins with an observation that, once heard, reorganizes everything that follows. Anger is temporary madness, not metaphorically, literally. The person in the grip of genuine anger, the full, unchecked, physiologically activated state that Seneca is describing, is not, in any meaningful sense, the person they normally are. Their judgment is impaired. Their perception is distorted. Their capacity for genuine rational assessment of the situation, for seeing what is actually happening rather than what the anger's narrative insists is happening, is significantly compromised. They are, in the specific technical sense that matters for practical purposes, not fully themselves. And the decisions made by a person who is not fully themselves are rarely the decisions that person would endorse in retrospect. This is the first and most important Stoic insight about anger. Not that it is morally wrong, though its unchecked expression frequently is. Not that it is spiritually inferior, though the Stoic framework would place it clearly among the passions to be overcome, but that it is practically counterproductive. That the goals anger claims to serve, the correction of injustice, the establishment of appropriate boundaries, the communication of genuine grievance, are almost always better served by the cool, clear, deliberately chosen response than by the hot, distorted, reactively generated one. Seneca cataloged the causes of anger with the thoroughness of a philosopher who had clearly observed them in himself as well as in others. Frustrated expectation, the gap between what we expected and what we received. Perceived disrespect, the judgment that we have been treated as less than we are worth. Thwarted desire, the obstacle placed between us and what we wanted. Injustice, real or perceived, inflicted on ourselves or on people and things we care about. Each of these causes, in the Stoic analysis, contains the same fundamental error: the judgment that something outside our control has violated something that was rightfully ours. The expectation that the world, other people, circumstances, the behavior of things outside our domain should have been different from what it was. And the specific, volatile combination of surprise and entitlement that expectation and reality's failure to match it reliably produces. The Stoic insight here is both philosophically precise and practically transformative. Most anger, examined honestly, is anger at the gap between the world as we expected it to be and the world as it actually is. Between the behavior we assumed we were owed and the behavior we received. Between the outcome we believed was rightfully ours and the outcome that circumstances produced. And the Stoic response to this gap is not the suppression of the feeling it generates. It is the examination of the expectation that created the gap. Because the expectation, the assumption that other people will behave as we prefer, that circumstances will cooperate with our preferences, that the world owes us the specific treatment we have decided we deserve, is almost always the exercise of control over something that is genuinely outside our domain. Marcus Aurelius addressed this with the specific, practical instruction that has made one of his passages among the most cited in the entire Stoic tradition. "Begin each day," he wrote, "by reminding yourself that you will encounter people who are meddlesome, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and antisocial. They behave this way because they do not know the difference between good and evil. But you have seen the nature of good and its beauty, so you cannot be harmed by them. You cannot be angry at them as though their failings were a surprise. This is not the counsel of someone who has given up on human beings or who expects nothing of them. It is the counsel of someone who has genuinely absorbed the Stoic understanding of human nature. The recognition that people behave in accordance with their current level of understanding, their current level of development, their current capacity for the wisdom that the Stoic tradition defines as the genuine good, and that the behavior that produces anger in us is almost always the behavior of someone whose understanding is, in that moment, limited. The Stoic response to limited understanding is not anger. It is something closer to the compassion of someone who has been reminded by the other's limitation of their own, who has recognized in the person whose behavior infuriates a reflection of their own past behavior or of their own current behavior in different circumstances, who has understood that the appropriate response to human limitation is not the rage of disappointed expectation, but the patient, genuinely philosophical recognition that people do what they know how to do with what they currently have. Seneca also addressed the physiology of anger, and here, 2,000 years before the neuroscience that has since confirmed his observations, he demonstrated a remarkably accurate understanding of what anger does to the body and the mind. He described the physical signs: the flushed face, the quickened breath, the tensed muscles, the narrowed focus that blocks peripheral perception. The specific physiological state that modern neuroscience identifies as the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response that evolution designed for genuine physical threat, and that the modern mind triggers in response to emails, traffic, and interpersonal conflict. And he offered, in response to these signs, an instruction that anticipates what cognitive behavioral therapy has since confirmed as the most effective behavioral intervention for anger management. Pause. Not forever. Not the permanent suppression of the feeling, but the specific, deliberate, physiologically grounded pause that creates the space between the triggering event and the response. The moment, just a moment in which the anger is acknowledged as present without being immediately acted upon, in which the Stoic examination can begin, in which the question can be asked, what is actually happening here? And what is the response I would genuinely choose if I were fully myself? Seneca recommended, in practical terms, that the person who feels anger rising should delay their response, should not speak immediately, should not act immediately, should give the physiological activation time to subside enough for the rational faculty to re-engage, not to eliminate the response, to choose it, to ensure that whatever is said or done in the aftermath of the provocation is said or done by the whole person rather than by the activated, distorted, temporary madman that unchecked anger produces. This pause, simple in description, genuinely demanding in practice, is the single most effective anger management tool available. Not because it resolves the underlying issue, not because it makes the provocation disappear or the grievance illegitimate, but because it restores the one thing that anger takes: the capacity for genuine choice about how to respond. Marcus Aurelius returned to the anger question throughout his journals with the consistency of someone who found it one of his most persistent challenges. He was governing an empire populated with difficult people, advisors who gave bad counsel, generals who made poor decisions, senators who acted from narrow self-interest rather than the common good. The opportunities for anger were, by any reasonable assessment, abundant. And yet he wrote repeatedly about the Stoic instruction to examine the anger before expressing it, to ask whether the person who provoked it was acting maliciously or ignorantly, to recognize that the malicious actor deserves pity more than anger, because the person who chooses to cause harm is in a worse condition than the person who receives it, and to recognize that the ignorant actor deserves instruction more than punishment, because they are behaving in accordance with what they know, which is the only thing any of us can do. He also wrote about the specific Stoic practice of perspective-taking as a tool against anger. The deliberate, imaginative act of stepping into the other person's position, of seeing the situation from inside their experience, with their history and their fears and their limitations as a means of softening the judgment that anger hardens. Not to excuse the behavior, but to understand it. And understanding, even partial understanding, is reliably incompatible with the full force of unchecked anger. The Stoics also address the anger that is directed not outward, but inward. The self-directed anger, the harsh, relentless, disproportionate judgment of one's own failures that many people carry as a constant companion. The inner critic that the Stoic practice of the examined life sometimes activates rather than quiets. The perfectionism that turns the inevitable imperfections of a genuinely attempted life into occasions for the kind of self-condemnation that serves neither growth nor well-being. Seneca addressed this with a tenderness that surprises many readers who expect the Stoic tradition to be harder on personal failure. He wrote about the importance of treating yourself with the same patience and the same compassion that you would extend to a good friend who had failed, of recognizing that the person who is genuinely trying, who is committed to the philosophical project, who is making the honest effort to close the gap between aspiration and behavior, will inevitably fall short, regularly, predictably, as a structural feature of what genuine growth requires, rather than as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The anger turned inward, the harsh self-judgment that treats every failure as confirmation of unworthiness, is as counterproductive as the anger turned outward. It consumes the energy that belongs to the genuine work. It narrows the perception that the genuine work requires, and it produces, in its chronic expression, the specific demoralization that makes the next attempt less likely rather than more. The Stoic response to personal failure is not anger. It is the honest examination, conducted with the same calm precision that the external examination of others' behavior requires, of what actually happened, what can be learned from it, and what the next attempt should look like. The forward-looking, practically oriented response of someone who understands that failure is the tuition of growth, rather than the evidence of its impossibility. There is a final dimension of the Stoic approach to anger that is worth examining carefully, because it is the one that most directly addresses the modern world's specific anger-producing conditions. We live in an age of manufactured outrage. The attention economy, the specific economic structure of the media and social media environments that most people inhabit for significant portions of each day, is built, in part, on the reliable engagement-producing power of anger. Content that provokes anger receives more attention than content that informs or entertains. Platforms that amplify conflict receive more engagement than platforms that facilitate genuine understanding. The economic incentives of the modern information environment are substantially aligned with the production of the specific emotional state that the Stoics identified as temporary madness. This is not a conspiracy. It is the natural consequence of a set of economic incentives operating without the counterweight of the philosophical wisdom that would recognize their effect. The person who understands this, who can see the anger-producing machinery of the modern information environment for what it is in a position to make a genuine choice about their relationship to it, to recognize the anger that the feed generates as the product of a system designed to generate it, to apply the Stoic pause before the reactive response, to ask whether the outrage that just arrived was produced by genuine injustice that requires genuine response, or by an algorithm that has learned, with extraordinary precision, exactly which buttons to push. Anger is not always wrong. The Stoics did not teach that righteous anger, the specific, proportionate, genuinely motivated response to genuine injustice, has no place in a well-ordered inner life. They taught that the anger, which is examined before it is expressed, which is proportionate to its provocation, which is directed at genuine wrong rather than at disappointed expectation. This anger is the appropriate response of a person whose values are real enough to be violated. What they taught against was the automatic, unchecked, physiologically driven anger that produces action before examination. The temporary madness that says and does things that the person would not, in their better moments, endorse. The fire that burns what took years to build in the time it takes to send a message or say the words that cannot be unsaid. The armor against anger is the pause, the examination, the honest assessment of whether what is felt is the proportionate response of a person whose genuine values have been genuinely violated, or the automatic reaction of a conditioned self whose expectations have been disappointed. That distinction, made consistently, practiced daily, applied with the patience that genuine philosophical development requires, is the difference between the person who is ruled by their anger and the person who has learned, imperfectly and progressively, to rule it. The fire is real. The question is whether you carry it or whether it carries you. Chapter 6. Against Fear. Fear is the oldest human experience, older than language, older than culture, older than the specific, historically contingent anxieties of any particular civilization or any particular moment in human history. The fear response, that specific, immediate, physiologically total mobilization of the organism in the face of perceived threat, was present in our ancestors long before they had the cognitive capacity to examine it, long before they had the philosophical tradition that would eventually ask what fear actually is, where it actually comes from, and what a genuinely wise relationship with it might look like. The Stoics were not the first to examine fear, but they were among the most thorough, and their examination, conducted not just in the library, but in the arena of genuine personal experience, by people who faced real threats of the most serious kind, produced insights about the nature of fear and the cultivation of courage that remain, 2,000 years later, both philosophically precise and practically indispensable. Let us begin, as the Stoics always preferred to begin, with a distinction. There are two fundamentally different kinds of fear. The first is the fear that serves, the immediate, automatic, physiologically grounded response to genuine present danger, the fear that tightens the body and sharpens the attention and mobilizes the organism for the specific action that the specific threat requires. This fear is not a failure of wisdom. It is a feature of biological design. It has kept human beings alive through conditions of genuine danger for as long as human beings have existed. And the Stoics, who were realists rather than idealists about the human condition, had no quarrel with it. The second kind of fear is the fear that does not serve, the projected, imagined, future-oriented fear of things that have not happened and may never happen in the form feared. The chronic, ambient, largely objectless anxiety that attaches itself to possibilities rather than actualities, to the what-ifs rather than the what-is. The fear that does not mobilize the organism for genuine action, but paralyzes it. That does not sharpen perception, but narrows it. That does not serve survival, but undermines the quality of the life being survived. It is this second kind, the fear that does not serve, that the Stoics addressed with the full force of their philosophical toolkit. And their primary tool was not the suppression of the feeling, but the examination of its object. What exactly are you afraid of? This question, asked directly, pursued honestly, answered specifically rather than allowed to remain in the vague, undifferentiated form that fear prefers, is the beginning of the Stoic approach to courage. Because courage, in the Stoic framework, is not the absence of fear. It is not the extraordinary endowment of those rare individuals who are simply constitutionally incapable of being frightened. It is the deliberate, practiced, philosophically grounded capacity to act in accordance with genuine values in the presence of fear. To feel the fear, genuinely, fully, without the spiritual bypass of pretending it is not there, and to choose, from within that feeling, the response that virtue requires. This is the definition of courage that distinguishes the Stoic account from the popular one. The popular account of courage tends toward the heroic, the dramatic, the visible, the single moment of extraordinary action under extraordinary pressure that we call bravery and celebrate in stories. The Stoic account is both more demanding and more democratic. It locates courage not in the exceptional moment, but in the ordinary one. Not in the battlefield, but in the daily, recurring, frequently invisible choice to act in accordance with genuine values when fear, in its many forms, presents the easier alternative of not doing so. Epictetus taught this with the directness of someone whose entire philosophical project was grounded in the specific, personal experience of what genuine courage required. As a slave, facing conditions in which the absence of physical freedom was not a philosophical thought experiment, but the lived reality of each day, he understood, from the inside, what it meant to maintain the inner freedom of genuine choice in circumstances that had removed every outer form of it. His teaching on fear was consistent with his teaching on everything else. The things you fear are outside your control. What you do in the presence of that fear is not. The response, the choice made, the action taken, the character expressed, is always, under any conditions, genuinely yours. And the person who has genuinely internalized this distinction, who has understood that the feared thing, however real its threat to external goods, cannot touch the inner citadel without permission, has already done the primary work of Stoic courage. He also taught something about fear that requires particular attention in the modern world. He observed that most of what people fear is not genuinely dangerous, that the organism's fear response, designed for genuine physical threat, is being triggered, in the modern context, by things that threaten not the body, but the ego, not the life, but the image, not genuine safety, but the specific, socially constructed goods, reputation, approval, status, the comfortable maintenance of others' positive perception, that the culture of personality, as we explored in our earlier MindShelf sessions, has elevated to the status of survival necessities. The fear of public speaking, the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of being seen as incompetent, as inadequate, as less than the image that has been so carefully constructed and maintained. These are real fears, genuinely felt, physiologically activated, behaviorally consequential. But their object is not genuine danger. Their object is the loss of external goods that the Stoic framework places firmly in the category of preferred indifference, things that are reasonable to prefer, not things whose loss constitutes genuine harm. The Stoic examination of these fears asks the question that their examination almost always reveals as the most important one. What is the actual worst case? Not the imagined worst case, inflated by the fear's automatic catastrophizing into something existential and total. The actual worst case, the specific, bounded, real-world consequence of the thing most feared. You give the presentation and it goes badly. What actually happens? You experience embarrassment, genuine, uncomfortable, real. And then what? Life continues. The presentation is over. The embarrassment fades. The person who survived it, who acted in the presence of the fear rather than in deference to it, has learned something that the person who avoided the presentation will not learn. That the feared outcome, encountered directly, was survivable, and that the survival of it has expanded, in some small but genuine way, the domain of what is possible. This is the Stoic understanding of courage as a practice rather than a trait. The progressive expansion, through repeated acts of deliberate engagement with what is feared, of the domain within which the person can act freely. Not the elimination of fear, which is neither achievable nor desirable, but the gradual, consistent, experience-based demonstration to the self that fear's predictions about what will happen are almost always worse than what actually does. Marcus Aurelius addressed the specific fear that his position required him to confront most regularly, the fear of death. Not abstractly, personally. As the Emperor of Rome, navigating wars and plague, and the full complexity of a role in which the proximity of death was a constant rather than an occasional feature of experience, he returned repeatedly in his journals to the Stoic examination of mortality. He drew on the Stoic tradition's most consistent teaching about death, that it is not evil, that the fear of death is the fear of a natural process, that the person who fears death is investing their peace in the maintenance of a condition, being alive, that is genuinely outside their control, and that will, with absolute certainty, end. And that the energy consumed by that fear, the years of life spent in the anticipatory suffering of a death that has not yet arrived, is the most literal possible example of sacrificing the actual life in service of the feared loss of it. He wrote about the great figures of history who had preceded him, the emperors, the philosophers, the warriors, the artists, and noted with the specific Stoic equanimity that repeated contemplation of mortality produces, that all of them had faced what he was facing, that the death he feared was the same death that every human being who had ever lived had eventually met, and that the quality of the life preceding it, the specific, daily, genuinely attempted expression of virtue and wisdom and genuine care, was the only thing that distinguished one death from another in any way that actually mattered. He was not indifferent to his own death. He was honest about it. And honesty about death, the genuine, examined, philosophically grounded acknowledgement of mortality, rather than its anxious avoidance, is, in the Stoic framework, one of the most life-enhancing practices available. Not because thinking about death makes life more enjoyable, but because the honest encounter with the fact of death restores, with remarkable efficiency, the sense of what actually matters, the clarity about what is worth fearing and what is not, the specific liberation of a person who has faced the worst case and found, in facing it, that the life available in its presence is more rather than less worth living. Seneca addressed the practical dimension of courage with an instruction that is both simple and demanding. Do the thing you fear, not recklessly, not without preparation, not in the absence of genuine assessment of genuine risk, but with the specific, deliberate, philosophically grounded commitment of someone who understands that the avoidance of fear does not reduce it, it compounds it. That every feared thing avoided grows larger in the imagination. That every feared thing engaged directly tends to shrink to its actual, manageable dimensions. This instruction, do the thing you fear, is not the counsel of bravado. It is the recognition of a psychological reality that the Stoics understood with remarkable precision. That courage is not a fixed quantity, distributed at birth in larger or smaller measures to different individuals. It is a capacity, developed through use, expanded through practice, made more available in each successive situation by the specific experience of having been available in the previous one. The person who acts in the presence of fear once discovers something that the person who defers to it cannot know: that the action was possible, that the fear, while genuine, was not prophetic, that the world on the other side of the feared threshold is more habitable than the fear predicted. And that discovery, made once, then again, is how Stoic courage is built. Not through the heroic gesture, through the daily, ordinary, frequently invisible choice to act in accordance with genuine values when fear presents the easier alternative. The armor against fear is not the elimination of the feeling. Fear will always be present. In a genuine life, genuinely lived, there will always be things worth fearing: genuine risks, genuine stakes, genuine possibilities of loss. The armor is the cultivated capacity to feel the fear and choose the action anyway. To maintain, in the presence of the fear response, the connection to genuine values that determines what the response will be. To be, in the specific Stoic sense of the word, courageous, not fearless, courageous. The distinction is everything. Fearlessness is the absence of a feeling. Courage is the presence of a choice. And choice, the prohairesis, the faculty of deliberate, voluntary, genuinely free response, is always, under any conditions, in any circumstances, whatever the fear presents as impossible, yours. Chapter 7. Against Distraction. There is a war being fought for your attention, not metaphorically, not as the dramatic framing of a cultural critic who wants to make a point about media consumption, but as the literal, economically motivated, technologically sophisticated, psychologically informed reality of the modern information environment. The platforms you use, the social media feeds, the news aggregators, the streaming services, the notification systems that punctuate each hour with the insistent signal that something somewhere requires your immediate awareness, are not neutral tools. They are the products of an industry whose business model depends, with mathematical precision, on the quantity of your attention that can be captured and held, and directed toward the content that generates the most engagement. And engagement, as the research that these platforms have conducted on their own users confirms, is not the same as value. The content that captures attention most reliably is not the content that informs most usefully, that enriches most genuinely, that serves the actual considered interests of the person whose attention it has captured. It is the content that triggers the most immediate, the most visceral, the most automatic response: the outrage, the desire, the fear, the social comparison, the specific emotional activations that the human nervous system is most reliably responsive to, and that the attention economy has learned, through the accumulation of billions of data points, to produce with extraordinary efficiency. The Stoics did not face this specific challenge, but they faced its essential equivalent, and they addressed it with a clarity that the modern world has not managed to surpass. Seneca wrote in one of his most urgent letters about the dissipation of attention, about the person who moves through life without ever genuinely inhabiting it, who is always partially elsewhere, always partially distracted, always giving to the present moment less than the present moment deserves, who reaches the end of a day or a year or a life and discovers that the time was spent but the living was not done, that the hours were filled but not inhabited, that the attention was distributed but never genuinely given. He wrote these words in the 1st century CE, without the internet, without the smartphone, without the 24-hour news cycle or the social media algorithm or the notification badge that reduces the threshold for interruption to essentially zero. And yet his description of the dissipated life, the life lived at the surface, in perpetual distraction from the depth that genuine presence would provide, is so recognizable to the modern reader that the 2,000 years between his world and ours seem to collapse entirely, because the problem Seneca was addressing is not fundamentally technological. It is fundamentally human. The tendency of the unguarded mind, the mind without the philosophical discipline that protects genuine attention, to be pulled outward, to be captured by whatever is most immediately stimulating, to sacrifice the depth of genuine engagement with what matters for the breadth of superficial contact with everything that doesn't. The technology has made this tendency more powerful, more efficiently exploited, more difficult to resist through ordinary willpower alone. But the tendency itself, the human mind's susceptibility to the capture of attention by stimulation, is as old as the human mind. The Stoics understood this, and they placed the discipline of attention, the deliberate, practiced, philosophically grounded protection of genuine focus, at the center of their practical philosophy. Marcus Aurelius wrote about attention in his journals with the consistency of someone who found it one of his most pressing practical challenges. He was governing an empire, a role that generated an essentially unlimited supply of demands on his attention. The diplomatic correspondence, the military reports, the administrative decisions, the petitions, the ceremonies, the philosophical reading he considered essential to the maintenance of his inner life. All of these competed for the finite resource of a single human mind's capacity for genuine engagement. And he wrote, repeatedly, about the Stoic instruction to return, to notice when the attention had wandered into the trivial, the merely urgent, the distraction that presented itself as necessity, and to bring it back to the work that actually mattered, to the present moment that was the only available domain of genuine life, to the values and the principles that were the actual foundation of everything he was trying to build. This return, the simple, unglamorous, endlessly repeated act of noticing that attention has been captured and redirecting it deliberately, is the primary practice of Stoic attention management, not the achievement of a permanent state of focused presence, not the elimination of distraction as a possibility, but the cultivation of the noticing, the meta-awareness that recognizes when the mind has been pulled away from where it genuinely chooses to be, and the practice capacity to return. It is, in its essentials, the same practice that modern mindfulness traditions describe as the core of meditation. The breath wanders and returns. The mind wanders and returns. The value is not in the unbroken focus, which is neither achievable nor the point. The value is in the returning, in the accumulated, repeated, gradually more automatic practice of reclaiming the attention that was given away without genuine choice. Epictetus addressed the social dimension of distraction with his characteristic directness. He observed that the person who is genuinely occupied with their own philosophical development, with the real work of becoming the person they are trying to be, has neither the time nor the inclination for the gossip, the social performance, The endless commentary on others' lives and others' choices that consumes so much of the attention of people who have not identified anything more important to pay attention to. This is not the counsel of antisocial withdrawal. Epictetus was not recommending the abandonment of genuine human connection or the dismissal of legitimate engagement with the world. He was identifying the specific, attention-consuming behaviors that substitute for genuine living, the commentary about others that substitutes for genuine self-examination, the social performance that substitutes for genuine relationship, the perpetual consumption of information about the world that substitutes for genuine engagement with the life actually available to be lived. The person who has genuine work, who has identified what actually matters and is genuinely pursuing it, relates to distraction differently from the person who has not because they are morally superior, but because the genuine work provides a reference point, a standard against which the distraction's claim on attention can be measured and found wanting. Seneca described this with a metaphor that resonates with particular force in the modern context. He wrote about the person who is always preparing to live, always acquiring the knowledge, the resources, the conditions that will eventually make genuine living possible, but who never actually begins. Who treats the preparation as the living rather than as its prerequisite. Who fills the time available for genuine engagement with the preliminary activities that seem to be pointing toward it without ever arriving. This is the distraction of busyness, the specific, modern, highly respectable form of attention dissipation that looks, from the outside, like productive engagement with the world, and that functions, from the inside, as the perpetual deferral of the genuine, examined, philosophically grounded life that busyness substitutes for. The Stoics addressed this through the practice of what Marcus Aurelius called confining yourself to the present, the deliberate, disciplined restriction of attention to what is actually, currently, really happening, the task at hand, the person in front of you, the specific, present opportunity for genuine engagement, rather than the perpetual partial presence of someone whose attention is always partly elsewhere. In the past, rehearsing what happened. In the future, anticipating what might. In the feed, monitoring what others are doing. In the commentary, evaluating what everything means. Everywhere but genuinely, fully, attentively here. The present moment is not exciting. This is one of the primary reasons it is so consistently abandoned in favor of the distraction that is. The present moment, the actual, unmediated, unenhanced experience of this specific situation, this specific person, this specific task, rarely competes successfully with the algorithmically optimized stimulation of the modern attention environment. It is quieter, less immediately rewarding, less perfectly calibrated to the specific triggers of the specific nervous system it is asking to engage with it. But it is real, and the distraction, however stimulating, however perfectly calibrated, is not. The engagement with the feed is not the same as engagement with the life. The consumption of others' experiences is not the same as the genuine inhabitation of your own. The perpetual monitoring of what is happening elsewhere is not the same as the full, attentive, genuinely present engagement with what is happening here. And the cumulative cost of this substitution, the years of genuine life spent in the attention-consuming equivalent of everywhere but genuinely here, is the cost that Seneca was describing when he wrote about the dissipated life. The life that was filled but not inhabited. That was busy but not genuine. That accumulated hours without accumulating the specific, irreplaceable quality of lived experience that genuine presence provides. The Stoic armor against distraction is not the elimination of technology or the retreat from the modern information environment. Both are impractical and, in any case, beside the point. The armor is the philosophical discipline of attention, the cultivated, practiced, deliberately maintained capacity to choose what deserves the finite resource of genuine focus and to protect that choice against the essentially unlimited supply of stimulation that the modern world offers as an alternative. This discipline begins with the identification of what actually matters. The genuine work, the genuine relationships, the genuine values that constitute the foundation of a life worth living. Because the person who knows what they are paying attention for, who has done the examined life's work of identifying what is actually worth the investment of genuine focus, is in a position to recognize distraction for what it is, not an alternative worth considering. A theft. The unauthorized extraction of the one resource that cannot be recovered once spent. Time spent distracted is time spent. It cannot be unspent. The hour given to the feed cannot be reclaimed for the work. The attention distributed across the surface of 100 trivial engagements cannot be gathered back into the depth of genuine presence. The life lived at the periphery of genuine experience cannot be relived from its center. Seneca's most famous statement about time is worth quoting in full, or as close to full as the spirit of the copyright principle permits. He wrote that we should not complain about the shortness of life. Life is long enough if we know how to use it. It is not that we have a short time to live. It is that we waste a great deal of it. Life is long enough, and it has been given in sufficiently generous measure to allow the accomplishment of the very greatest things, if the whole of it is well invested. The investment he is describing is not financial. It is attentional. The deliberate, philosophically grounded, daily practice choice to give the finite resource of genuine attention to what genuinely deserves it, rather than to what most immediately claims it. Attention is the ultimate asset, not money, not status, not the accumulation of experiences or the expansion of influence or the achievement of any particular goal. The quality of attention brought to the life actually available to be lived, the specific, present, irreplaceable reality of this moment, this relationship, this work, this opportunity for genuine engagement, is the measure of how fully the life is being inhabited. The Stoics knew this. They built their entire practice around the protection and the disciplined direction of this one resource. Not because they were ascetics who rejected the world's legitimate pleasures, but because they understood, with the clear-eyed precision of people who had examined the question with genuine philosophical seriousness, that the quality of attention determines the quality of everything, of every relationship, of every piece of work, of every experience, of every moment that constitutes, in its accumulated totality, what will eventually be looked back upon as a life. Guard your attention with the same vigilance, the same deliberate, philosophically grounded, daily practiced protective discipline that the Stoics brought to every dimension of the inner citadel, because everything inside it, every value, every relationship, every genuine aspiration, is only as real as the attention that brings it into full, genuine, present moment life. Part 3. The Battlefield. Stoicism applied to modern life. Chapter 8. Stoicism at Work. Work is where most people spend the majority of their waking hours, where the majority of their identity is invested, where the majority of their daily encounters with difficulty, frustration, injustice, and the full complexity of human nature actually occur. And it is, for exactly these reasons, one of the most important and most neglected domains of Stoic application. Because the Stoic framework was not designed for the monastery. It was not designed for the philosophical retreat, or the private journal, or the quiet contemplation of someone who has arranged their life to minimize friction. It was designed for the arena, for the place where the stakes are real, the pressures are genuine, the other people are difficult, and the gap between aspiration and reality is most immediately, most uncomfortably visible. Work is that place, for most people, most of the time. The Stoic approach to work begins with a distinction that is both simple and genuinely transformative. The distinction between what work is for and what work produces. Between the inner purpose of the activity, the expression of genuine capability, the contribution of real value, the exercise of virtue in the specific domain of professional life, and the outer results that the activity generates. The salary, the promotion, the recognition, the status, the specific outcomes that the ambitious professional mind is trained to treat as the measure of success. Both matter. The Stoics were not indifferent to outcomes. They did not teach that the quality of work is independent of the results it produces, or that the professional who ignores outcomes is demonstrating philosophical wisdom rather than professional irresponsibility. But they taught, with the precision of the dichotomy of control applied to the professional domain, that the outcomes of work are not fully within the worker's control. They are influenced by the quality of the work. They are influenced by the choices made, the effort invested, the genuine capability brought to bear. But they are also influenced by factors that the individual worker does not control: the market, the organizational politics, the timing, the decisions made by other people in other rooms about things that directly affect the outcomes of work done in this one. The Stoic worker, the person who has genuinely internalized the dichotomy in the professional domain, directs their full energy toward what is within their control. The quality of the preparation, the integrity of the execution, the genuine engagement with the work itself, rather than the perpetual partial engagement of someone whose attention is always partly on the outcome, rather than fully on the activity. And releases, with genuine equanimity rather than performed acceptance, the outcome that this effort produces in a world they do not fully control. This is not the counsel of low ambition. The Stoic approach to work is not the invitation to stop caring about outcomes or to lower the standards by which professional success is measured. It is the recognition that the highest quality of work, the most genuinely engaged, most fully focused, most creatively alive professional activity, is produced by the person who is most fully present to the work itself, whose attention is on the task rather than the reward, whose energy is directed toward the activity rather than split between the activity and the anxious monitoring of how the activity is being received. This is what psychologists now call flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging activity that produces both the highest quality of output and the deepest experience of genuine satisfaction. And the conditions for flow are precisely the conditions that the Stoic orientation toward work creates. The full investment of attention in the present activity, the release of outcome anxiety that allows the attention to remain undivided. The genuine engagement with the work itself as the primary source of value, rather than merely the instrument for the production of external rewards. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire from this orientation. He wrote, in his journals, about the importance of doing each thing, each specific, present, particular task, as though it were the only thing, with the full investment of attention and care that the activity deserved, regardless of whether anyone was watching, regardless of whether the outcome would be recognized, regardless of whether the effort would produce the specific result that ambition preferred. This is what he meant when he wrote about doing your work as though you were dying. Not with the frantic urgency of someone trying to complete everything before time runs out, but with the quality of attention that the awareness of mortality reliably produces, the specific, focused, genuine engagement with what is actually in front of you that the habitual postponement of full presence always defers. The Stoic framework also addresses one of the most common and most genuinely difficult challenges of professional life: the experience of injustice, the encounter with an organizational environment that does not reward merit reliably, that distributes recognition according to criteria that have nothing to do with the quality of the work, that promotes the politically skilled over the genuinely capable, that makes decisions that are clearly wrong and suffers no immediate consequences for making them. This experience, so common as to be nearly universal in any complex organization, is one of the most reliable generators of the specific anger and resentment that the previous chapter identified as the most destructive of the passions. And the Stoic response to it is both more nuanced and more practically useful than the simple instruction to accept it. The Stoic does not accept injustice passively. The tradition that produced Cato, who fought the corruption of the late Roman Republic with genuine passion and genuine sacrifice, is not a tradition of passive acceptance of wrong. The Stoic response to injustice is the honest examination of what is actually within the individual's control to address. The specific, practical, available actions that might improve the situation. The communication of genuine grievance through the appropriate channels. The deliberate, strategic engagement with the organizational dynamics that produce the injustice in the first place. What the Stoic releases, with genuine equanimity rather than performed acceptance, is the outcome of this engagement, the response of the organization to the honest communication, the decision of the people in power about whether to address what has been identified, the specific resolution that the effort toward justice produces or fails to produce. Not because justice is unimportant, but because the alternative, the investment of peace in the organization's behavior, the subordination of inner stability to the specific outcome of a process that is genuinely outside individual control, is a form of suffering that serves neither the individual nor the cause of justice that produced it. Epictetus addressed the specific challenge of difficult colleagues, the person at work whose behavior is consistently frustrating, whose competence is unreliable, whose character is genuinely problematic. With the same instruction he brought to every encounter with difficult human behavior. Understand what they are, and respond to what they are rather than to what you wish they were. The colleague who takes credit for others' work is behaving in accordance with their current level of understanding about what genuine success requires. The manager who leads through fear rather than genuine capability is doing what they know how to do with what they currently have. the organization that rewards political skill over genuine contribution, is reflecting the specific values of the specific people who currently lead it. None of this excuses the behavior. All of it contextualizes it. And the contextualization, the genuine attempt to understand what is actually producing the frustrating behavior, rather than simply reacting to the behavior itself, is the beginning of the response that serves, rather than the reaction that doesn't. The Stoic also brings a specific orientation to professional ambition that distinguishes their relationship to career from the relationship of someone whose identity is entirely invested in professional outcomes. The Stoic is ambitious, genuinely, energetically, fully committed to the development and the expression of their professional capabilities. But their ambition is grounded in the inner domain rather than organized around the outer one. What this means practically is that the Stoic professional can pursue advancement without being destroyed by the failure to achieve it, can compete without being consumed by the result of the competition, can care about recognition without making their equanimity contingent on receiving it, can invest fully in professional goals without losing, in the investment, the connection to the values that constitute genuine well-being, regardless of what the professional outcomes deliver. This is not the absence of ambition. It is its most sustainable form. The ambition that does not destroy the person who holds it when the outcome falls short of what was hoped. That does not produce the specific, grinding, identity-threatening suffering of the person whose entire sense of self is organized around professional outcomes that circumstances do not fully control. Seneca wrote about the relationship between professional success and genuine happiness with a directness that the modern obsession with career achievement rarely permits. He observed that the people who had achieved the most powerful, the most recognized, the most apparently successful, were not, in his experience, the most genuinely content. That the achievement of ambitious professional goals reliably produced a brief period of satisfaction, followed by the recalibration of ambition to a new, more distant target. That the finish line moved. That the rest that was promised by success did not arrive with it. This is not the counsel of professional mediocrity. It is the honest observation of someone who had both achieved significant professional success and examined its relationship to genuine well-being with philosophical rigor. And the conclusion he drew, that genuine contentment is not the destination of professional ambition, but the foundation from which it is pursued, is one of the most practically important insights available to the modern professional. Do the work well, invest fully, pursue genuine capability and genuine contribution with the full force of available energy and intelligence. But do it from the grounded, equanimous, genuinely stable inner position of someone who knows, not just intellectually, but in the deep, practiced way that genuine philosophical development produces, that the quality of the work is the domain they control, and the recognition, the reward, the specific outcome, these will be what they will be, influenced by the work but not determined by it, received with appropriate satisfaction when they arrive, and with appropriate equanimity when they do not. The workplace is a philosophical laboratory. Every frustrating colleague is a test of the patience and the compassion that the Stoic framework teaches. Every unjust outcome is a test of the equanimity that the dichotomy of control is designed to produce. Every ambitious goal is a test of the capacity to invest fully while releasing the outcome genuinely. Every difficult conversation is a test of the examined life's self-knowledge and the disciplined attention's genuine presence. The Stoic does not go to work despite the philosophical life. They practice the philosophical life at work, in the meetings and the negotiations and the performance reviews and the difficult conversations and the moments of genuine recognition and the moments of genuine injustice. In all of it, the armor is either being worn or it is not. Wear it, every day, imperfectly and persistently, and with the genuine commitment of someone who understands that the battlefield of professional life is as real and as philosophically significant as any arena the Stoics ever described. Chapter 9. Stoicism in Relationships. Of all the domains in which the Stoic philosophy is applied, and we have now moved through anxiety, anger, fear, distraction, and the professional life, relationships present the most subtle, the most personally demanding, and in many ways, the most important test of whether the philosophy has been genuinely internalized or merely intellectually understood. Because relationships are the place where the distance between knowing the principles and living them is most immediately, most uncomfortably visible, where the dichotomy of control is most difficult to maintain, where the attachment to external goods, to specific people, to the continuation of specific connections, to the specific forms that love takes in particular relationships, is most deeply, most understandably human, and where the failure to apply the Stoic framework most reliably produces the specific, recurring, genuinely costly suffering that the philosophy is designed to address. Let us begin with the most fundamental and most challenging Stoic teaching about relationships. The teaching that most readers encounter with the most resistance. Not because it is wrong, but because it is so directly contrary to what the culture of romantic love, in particular, has taught us to believe about what genuine love requires. You cannot control another person, their feelings, their choices, their continued presence in your life. These are outside your domain. Completely, unconditionally, regardless of how much you love them, how well you treat them, how fully you invest in the relationship, how desperately you need them to remain. This is not a cynical observation about the unreliability of human beings. It is the application of the dichotomy of control to the domain of human connection, and its implication for the person who has genuinely absorbed it, rather than merely acknowledged it intellectually, is both liberating and demanding in equal measure. Liberating, because it removes the specific, exhausting, ultimately futile project of trying to secure another person's love through the management of their experience, the careful monitoring of their mood, the anxious adjustment of your own behavior to maintain their approval, the subordination of genuine self-expression to the maintenance of an image that you believe, often incorrectly, is what they need you to be. Demanding, because it requires the genuine, ongoing, never fully completed practice of loving without the security of guaranteed return, of investing in another person's well-being without the certainty that the investment will be reciprocated, or that the relationship will continue in the form that makes the investment feel worthwhile. Epictetus addressed the attachment to specific people, the clinging to the continuation of specific relationships, with a directness that his students found both clarifying and difficult. He taught the practice of holding everything in life, every relationship, every connection, Every person whose presence constitutes a significant portion of the inner life's furniture, with what he called open hands. The deliberate, philosophically grounded practice of appreciating what is present without requiring it to be permanent, of loving fully without converting the love into the specific, contractual, outcome-dependent thing that attachment makes it. He used an image that has stayed in the philosophical tradition for 2,000 years. When you are given something to hold, a beautiful object, a cherished relationship, a period of genuine happiness, hold it as something borrowed rather than something owned. Appreciate it fully. Care for it genuinely, but hold it with the awareness that it may be recalled at any time. Not with the defensive detachment of someone who refuses to be fully present to what they have been given. With the open, grateful, genuinely appreciating presence of someone who knows that what they have been given is a gift rather than a possession. This is the Stoic practice of amor fati, the love of fate, applied to human relationships. The capacity to receive what is given with genuine appreciation and to release what is taken with genuine equanimity. Not because the loss doesn't matter, but because the alternative, the clinging that converts love into the anxious management of another person's continued presence, diminishes both the love and the person who holds it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about his relationships with a tenderness that surprises readers who expect the Stoic tradition to produce emotional coolness. He wrote about his wife Faustina, about his children, about the friends and the teachers and the mentors who had shaped his philosophical development, with genuine warmth and genuine gratitude. He did not love at a distance. He loved fully, with the specific, particular, deeply personal investment in specific human beings that genuine love requires. But he also wrote in the same journals about the Stoic practice of holding these relationships with the awareness of their impermanence, of reminding himself, not as a morbid exercise, but as the specific philosophical practice that genuine equanimity requires, that the people he loved were mortal, that the relationships he valued were finite, that the continued presence of the people who constituted his most significant connections was not guaranteed by the depth of his investment in them. He was not practicing detachment. He was practicing what the Stoics called the premeditation of loss, the deliberate, philosophically grounded acknowledgement of what is genuinely at risk in every significant attachment, as a means of deepening rather than diminishing the appreciation of what is currently present. Because the person who has genuinely acknowledged the possibility of loss, who has sat with the specific reality that the relationship they most value will not last forever, that the person they most love is finite, that every moment of genuine connection is happening against the backdrop of its own impermanence. This person relates to the present moment of the relationship differently from the person who is not, more attentively, more gratefully, more fully present to what is actually there rather than what is taken for granted, more genuinely invested in the specific, present, irreplaceable reality of this person in this moment, rather than the comfortable assumption that this person and this moment will always be available. The Stoic approach to relationships also addresses one of the most common and most genuinely damaging patterns in human connection: the pattern of trying to change other people, of investing significant energy in the project of making the people we love into the people we need them to be. of relating to others, not as they actually are, but as we wish they were, and experiencing, in the gap between the actual person and the preferred one, the specific frustration that this mismatch reliably produces. The dichotomy of control is unambiguous about other people's behavior. It is outside our domain. We can influence, we can model, we can communicate clearly about what we need and what we find difficult. We can create the conditions of honesty, of genuine care, of the specific quality of attention that makes people feel genuinely seen, in which growth becomes more rather than less likely. But we cannot compel it. We cannot determine another person's choices. We cannot make someone be who they are not. And the attempt to do so is not only futile, but damaging. To the other person, who experiences the attempt as the rejection of who they actually are, and to the relationship, which becomes organized around the management of a gap that neither party can close. Epictetus was clear about this. Focus on your own philosophical development, on your own character, on your own choices, and your own responses, and your own genuine expression of the values that constitute the good life. Not because others' development is unimportant, but because it is not within your control, and the energy invested in the attempt to control it is energy taken from the only development that actually is. The Stoics also address the specific challenge of conflict in relationships, the inevitable, structural, genuinely human experience of two people with different histories and different needs and different ways of understanding the world, encountering each other's limitations and occasionally each other's worst behavior. The Stoic framework approaches relationship conflict with the same basic tools it brings to every other form of interpersonal difficulty. The examination of the impression before the reaction. The honest assessment of what is actually within control. The quality of the response. The clarity of the communication. The genuine attempt to understand the other's position and what is not. The other's feelings. The other's choices. The outcome of the conflict. The practice of perspective taking that the previous chapter on anger identified as one of the most reliable tools for softening the judgment that conflict hardens. And the specific, Stoic instruction that Marcus Aurelius returned to in his journals whenever he wrote about the difficult people in his life, the recognition that the person whose behavior is causing difficulty is doing so from their current level of understanding. That the appropriate response to limited understanding in any domain, including the intimate one, is not judgment, but something closer to the compassionate patience of someone who has their own limitations and knows it. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior. The Stoic framework does not counsel the passive toleration of genuine wrong in close relationships. It counsels a clear-eyed, proportionate, genuinely considered response to that wrong, the communication of what is not acceptable, the establishment of the boundaries that genuine self-respect requires, the willingness to make the difficult decisions that ongoing genuine harm sometimes makes necessary. But it counsels all of this from the examined, equanimous, genuinely grounded inner position of someone who is responding rather than reacting, who is choosing rather than being driven, who is maintaining, even in the most difficult interpersonal territory, the connection to genuine values that is the foundation of everything the Stoic life is trying to build. Seneca wrote about friendship with a depth and a warmth that reveals the full social richness of the Stoic life at its best. He identified genuine friendship, the specific, rare, mutually developing connection between people who genuinely see each other and genuinely care about each other's philosophical development as one of the great goods available to human beings. Not a preferred indifferent, a genuine good. One of the specific forms through which the Stoic values of wisdom and virtue and genuine care are most fully expressed and most fully received. He also identified the qualities that genuine friendship requires, and they are, in their essentials, the Stoic qualities applied to the relational domain. Honesty. The willingness to tell the truth to a friend, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Genuine interest in the other's well-being, rather than the management of their perception of you. The patience to be present with difficulty, rather than absent from it. The courage to offer genuine counsel, rather than comfortable reassurance. These are demanding qualities. They are more demanding than the easier, more comfortable form of connection that most people settle for. The social relationship that maintains pleasant surfaces without penetrating to genuine depth. But they produce something that the pleasant surface cannot. The specific, irreplaceable experience of being genuinely known, of having your actual self, with its genuine strengths and its genuine limitations, and the specific, particular, unrepeatable combination of both, met with genuine acceptance and genuine care. That experience, which Seneca identified as one of the deepest goods available to a human life, is only possible in the presence of the Stoic qualities. The honesty that risks the comfortable surface, the courage that offers the uncomfortable truth, the genuine care that prioritizes the other's actual well-being over the maintenance of their positive perception of you. Love, in the Stoic framework, is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a practice that you choose. The daily, imperfect, genuinely demanding choice to extend genuine care to the specific, actual, sometimes frustrating, always finite human being in front of you, without the conditions that attachment imposes, without the requirement that they be different from what they are, without the security of guaranteed permanence, without the management of their experience to produce the specific response that your need for their love requires. This is the most difficult form of love available, and, the Stoics would argue, the most genuine. Not the love that is easy when everything is going well, when the person is behaving as preferred, and the relationship is producing the specific experiences that were hoped for, but the love that persists in the presence of difficulty. That maintains its genuine investment in the other's well-being when the other's behavior is frustrating, when the relationship is demanding, when the gap between the actual person and the preferred one is most visibly, most uncomfortably present. Love without clinging, care without controlling, presence without requiring permanence. That is the Stoic relationship, not the easiest form of human connection available, the most enduring one. Chapter 10. Stoicism and Money. Money is one of the most philosophically interesting subjects available to a human being, not because it is intrinsically fascinating. As a thing in itself, money is among the most neutral objects in existence. A piece of metal, a printed note, a number on a screen. It has no color, no warmth, no inherent quality that makes it good or bad, beneficial or harmful, worthy of pursuit or worthy of contempt. What makes money philosophically interesting is what it reveals about values, about priorities, about the specific, often unconscious assumptions that govern the daily choices of people who have never examined their relationship with it closely enough to understand what that relationship actually reflects. The Stoics examined it very closely, and what they found, expressed in the writings of people who occupied every possible position on the spectrum of material circumstance, from the slave who owned nothing to the advisor to the emperor who managed the wealth of an empire, is both more nuanced and more practically useful than either the culture of acquisition or the culture of renunciation has managed to produce. Let us begin with Seneca. Because Seneca's relationship with money is, in some respects, the most instructive in the entire Stoic tradition. Not because he was the most philosophical. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus both provide richer philosophical treatments. But because his circumstances were the most apparently contradictory, and the way he resolved that contradiction reveals something important about what the Stoic position on wealth actually is. Seneca was extraordinarily wealthy. By some historical estimates, among the wealthiest men in Rome. He owned multiple villas, maintained a significant household, lived in conditions of material comfort that most of his contemporaries could not have imagined. And he wrote, from within those conditions of material comfort, some of the most philosophically rigorous arguments against the pursuit of wealth as a source of genuine happiness that the ancient world produced. His critics, in his own time and across the centuries since, have found this combination hypocritical. How, they asked, can a man who owns more than almost anyone argue that wealth does not contribute to genuine happiness? Is this not the specific, self-serving philosophy of someone who wants to enjoy what he has while being admired for not needing it? Seneca's response to this charge was both honest and philosophically precise. He did not deny that he was wealthy. He did not pretend that wealth was irrelevant to the quality of his daily life, or that its absence would make no practical difference to his circumstances. What he argued, with the specific, careful distinction that the Stoic framework requires, is that wealth is a preferred indifferent, something that is reasonable to acquire and reasonable to enjoy, but not something whose presence or absence determines the quality of the inner life, not something that deserves the investment of genuine peace, not something whose loss should constitute genuine suffering for the person who has understood what genuine well-being actually is. He wrote about his relationship with his wealth in terms that illuminate the Stoic position with unusual clarity. He said, I enjoy my wealth, but I am prepared to lose it. I live well in this villa, but I would live equally well in a simpler one. I eat well at this table, but I would eat without distress at a poorer one. The wealth is present. I am not attached to it. And the difference between enjoying something without attachment and enjoying something with attachment is not visible in the enjoying. It is only visible in the losing. This is the Stoic distinction between use and attachment, between the reasonable, grateful, unencumbered enjoyment of material goods, including the significant material goods that genuine wealth provides, and the specific, psychological, identity-constituting dependence on those goods that attachment produces. The person who uses wealth without being attached to it can enjoy everything that wealth provides without experiencing the specific suffering that comes when wealth is threatened or lost. The person who is attached to it, whose sense of self, whose security, whose fundamental okayness depends on its maintenance, carries, within the apparent comfort of material abundance, the specific anxiety of someone who knows that what they most depend on is genuinely outside their control. Epictetus approached the same distinction from the opposite end of the material spectrum. He had nothing. As a slave, and then, after his manumission, as a philosopher who lived simply by genuine philosophical preference rather than necessity, he had no wealth to be attached to. And he taught, from within that condition of material simplicity, a freedom and a contentment that the wealthy Seneca was articulating from within his villas. His teaching on wealth was consistent with his teaching on everything else. Money is outside our control. Its presence or absence is the product of circumstances, of inheritance, of the specific historical and social conditions into which a person is born and through which they move. The person who makes their peace contingent on its presence has made their peace contingent on something they do not control. And the person who has understood this, who has genuinely released the inner investment in money's maintenance, is free in a way that no amount of money can purchase and no amount of poverty can take away. This does not mean that poverty is preferable to wealth. The Stoics were not ascetics who taught that material comfort was spiritually inferior to material deprivation. They taught that neither was genuinely relevant to the inner life's quality, that the genuinely wise person, the Stoic sage, would be equally content in either condition, not because the conditions were equivalent in their practical dimensions. They are not. Poverty involves genuine practical difficulty that wealth does not. But because the inner life's quality, the specific, philosophically grounded equanimity that genuine Stoic development produces, is not determined by the material conditions surrounding it. Marcus Aurelius occupied the most materially abundant position available in the ancient world, and he wrote in his private journals about his consistent effort to maintain the inner simplicity that the Stoic tradition identified as the genuine foundation of well-being. He noted the tendency of wealth and power to corrupt, not through dramatic moral failure, but through the subtler, more insidious corruption of the person who begins to believe that the external goods they possess are reflections of their inner worth, who begins to confuse what they have with who they are. He returned repeatedly to the Stoic instruction that had been central to his philosophical education. Do not value what fortune gives. Value what fortune cannot take. The inner goods, the wisdom, the integrity, the quality of genuine character that remain in the absence of every external advantage. These are the genuine goods. Everything else is on loan. The Stoic framework also addresses the specific relationship between money and time that the modern financial independence movement, which we explored in our session on Grant Sabatier's Financial Freedom, has made central to the contemporary conversation about wealth. Seneca's most urgent writing is about time, about the squandering of the one resource that is genuinely irreplaceable, about the person who spends their finite hours in the accumulation of money beyond what is required for a genuinely comfortable life, and who discovers, at the end of those hours, that the money accumulated was not worth the life spent accumulating it. He was not arguing against financial prudence or the reasonable provision for future security. He was arguing against the specific, insatiable form of money-seeking that is organized not around genuine need, but around the perpetual, self-reinforcing desire for more. The desire that does not diminish with satisfaction, but intensifies with it. That sets each new threshold as the destination, and then, when the destination is reached, immediately establishes the next one at a distance sufficient to ensure that genuine contentment remains perpetually deferred. This is what the Stoics identified as one of the primary mechanisms of human suffering, not poverty. The specific psychological structure of insatiable desire that makes genuine contentment unavailable regardless of the material conditions surrounding it. The moving threshold that ensures that enough is always just beyond what is currently possessed. The Stoic antidote to this, and it is one of the most practically important Stoic practices available in the modern financial context, is the cultivation of what Seneca called contento. Contentment, not the resignation of someone who has given up on material improvement, but the genuine, philosophically grounded capacity to experience what is currently present as sufficient, to feel in the actual conditions of the actual life currently being lived, not the improved future conditions that ambition is reaching toward, the specific quality of sufficiency that genuine contentment requires. This practice begins with a deliberate, specific examination of what is actually present, the food that is available, the shelter that is provided, the relationships that constitute the social fabric of the current life, the health that is currently functioning, the specific, particular, often overlooked abundance of an ordinary life examined honestly, rather than measured against the imagined abundance of a wealthier one. Seneca practiced this through what he called the voluntary simplicity exercise. The deliberate, periodic adoption of simpler conditions, eating plainly, dressing simply, foregoing the material comforts that habitual wealth had made invisible, not as permanent asceticism, but as the specific philosophical practice that reveals the genuine adequacy of what is already present. The person who has voluntarily simplified knows something that the person who has never lacked does not. That the simpler life is more livable than the habituated mind feared. That what was assumed to be necessary for genuine well-being is, in practice, often a comfort rather than a requirement. And that the knowledge of this, the genuine, experientially grounded knowledge, rather than the merely intellectual acknowledgement, produces a quality of freedom in the relationship with material goods that no amount of wealth alone can manufacture. He also wrote about the specific freedom that financial sufficiency, as opposed to financial excess, provides. The person who has enough, who has secured the genuine needs of the life without the endless, energy-consuming project of accumulating beyond them, is free to direct their attention toward what the Stoic tradition identified as the genuine goods. The philosophical development, the genuine relationships, the specific, present, irreplaceable quality of a life fully inhabited, rather than a life spent in the pursuit of the conditions that would eventually, if only enough of them were accumulated, make genuine living possible. The modern world has not improved on the Stoic analysis of money. In some respects, it has made it more urgent. The marketing infrastructure of the modern consumer economy is devoted, with extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary reach, to the manufacture of desire, to the perpetual creation of new wants, new products, new experiences, new status markers, that present themselves as needs and that generate, in the person who internalizes them as such, the specific suffering of someone who genuinely lacks what they actually merely want. The Stoic framework offers the specific, philosophically grounded alternative, not the rejection of material goods, not the performance of ascetic virtue for its own sake, but the examined, honest, genuinely personal assessment of what is actually required for genuine well-being, and the specific, liberating recognition that the threshold of genuine sufficiency is almost always lower than the culture of acquisition suggests it is. Money is a tool. In the hands of the person who understands it as such, who uses it without being used by it, who enjoys it without being attached to it, who pursues it reasonably without making their peace contingent on its presence. It is a genuinely useful tool, one that provides genuine practical benefits, and that, managed wisely, expands rather than contracts the domain of genuine freedom. In the hands of the person who has confused it with the genuine good, who has organized their identity around its accumulation, their security around its maintenance, their sense of self around what it purchases, it is something quite different. Not a tool, a master. One that commands the attention, the energy, and the hours of a life that were always capable of being directed towards something more enduring. The Stoic instruction is both simple and genuinely demanding. Use money. Do not be used by it. Enjoy what it provides without requiring what it cannot. Pursue it reasonably and release it equanimously. And in the gap between what you have and what you want, look honestly at whether the gap is genuinely there, or whether it is the manufactured product of a culture that profits from your conviction that it is. Part 4. The Daily Practice. Living the Philosophy. Chapter 11. The Morning and Evening Disciplines. Philosophy without practice is literature. It may be beautiful literature. It may be intellectually rich, historically fascinating, personally inspiring. It may produce the specific, genuine pleasure of encountering an idea that reorganizes something in the mind. But if it remains at the level of the encountered idea, if it does not descend from the intellectual appreciation to the daily, embodied, behaviorally expressed practice of a life, actually lived differently, it is not yet philosophy in the sense that the Stoics meant. The Stoics meant practice. They always meant practice. The entire tradition, from Zeno's first teachings in the Painted Porch, through Chrysippus's systematic elaboration, through Cicero's Roman adaptation, through the extraordinary personal documents of Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, was organized around a single, central, consistently reiterated insistence. Philosophy is not what you know. It is what you do. And what you do is determined more than anything else by the quality of your daily habits. The specific, recurring, largely automatic practices that constitute the texture of ordinary life. The morning routines that set the tone for the day. The evening practices that review it. The small, daily, frequently invisible choices that accumulate, with the same reliable compounding that Sabatier described in the financial domain, into the character that is either being built or being eroded by the way each ordinary day is actually lived. The Stoics understood this, and they built specific daily practices, morning and evening disciplines, into the philosophical life with the thoroughness of people who understood that understanding the principles was not the same as living them, and that living them required the specific structural support of daily practice that philosophy without practice perpetually lacks. Let us begin with the morning, because the morning is where everything starts, where the quality of the entire day is most significantly shaped, where the choice, made consciously or by default, about what kind of person to be in this particular day is most available, most malleable, most genuinely open to deliberate direction. Marcus Aurelius began each morning with what the Stoic tradition calls the premeditation of difficulties. Not the anxiety-driven anticipation of what might go wrong, which is the fear-organized, future catastrophizing response that the previous chapter on anxiety identified as one of the primary mechanisms of unnecessary suffering, but the philosophically grounded, practically oriented preparation of a mind that knows what it is likely to face and has chosen, in advance, how it intends to respond. He would remind himself, in the quiet of the early morning before the day's demands arrived, that the day ahead would contain difficult people. People who were meddlesome, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous. Not because he was pessimistic about human nature, but because he was realistic about it. And because the person who is surprised by difficult human behavior, who encounters the pettiness and the self-interest and the occasional genuine cruelty of ordinary human life, as though encountering it for the first time, is less prepared to respond to it with the equanimity and the genuine care that the Stoic framework requires than the person who has anticipated it. He would also remind himself, in the same morning reflection, of the Stoic principles that were the intended foundation of his response to everything the day would bring. The dichotomy of control, the primacy of virtue, the recognition that the people whose behavior would frustrate him were doing what they knew how to do, the reminder that his own domain, the quality of his judgments, the integrity of his choices, the genuine effort of his preparation, was entirely within his control, regardless of what the day delivered. This morning, philosophical preparation is not the same as positive thinking. It does not manufacture an optimistic mood or attempt to predetermine the emotional tone of the day through the deliberate generation of positive feeling. It is something more honest and more genuinely useful. The deliberate, specific, practically grounded alignment of the mind with the values and the principles that are meant to guide the day's choices before the heat of the day makes those choices more difficult and the principles less available. He wrote about this practice with the specificity of someone who had discovered, through experience, its genuine, practical value. The mind that begins the day with philosophical reading is a different instrument for the rest of the day than the mind that begins it with the news feed or the email inbox or the social media scroll. Not because the philosophical reading produces a particular emotional state, but because it orients the attention, before the day's distractions claim it, toward what the philosophical life has identified as genuinely important, providing a reference point against which the day's demands can be measured and their genuine significance assessed. Epictetus added a morning practice that is both simpler and more demanding than either the premeditation of difficulties or the philosophical reading. He recommended that the first thing each morning, before any other orientation toward the day, the Stoic practitioner ask a single question: what is within my control today? Not the outcomes, not the circumstances, not the behavior of the people who will be encountered, but the specific, practical, available domain of genuine choice, the quality of the preparation, the integrity of the responses, the genuine expression of the values that constitute the philosophical life, that is always, under any conditions, genuinely theirs. This question, asked honestly, answered specifically, held as a genuine orientation rather than a rhetorical gesture, is the most efficient morning alignment available. It does what the entire preceding chapters have been attempting to do in more extended form. It redirects the attention in a single moment of genuine reflection from the domain of the uncontrollable to the domain of the genuinely available, from the anxiety-producing external world to the genuinely empowering internal one. Now, the evening. Because the evening review is, in many respects, the more important of the two disciplines. The morning prepares, the evening learns, and the learning, the honest, specific, practically grounded examination of what actually happened in the gap between the morning's intention and the day's actual behavior, is the primary instrument through which genuine philosophical development occurs over time. Seneca was the most detailed of the Stoic writers on the evening review. He described the practice with a specificity that reveals his genuine commitment to it, and that makes it immediately available as a practical instruction rather than a vague philosophical aspiration. Before sleep, before the mind moves into the passive receptivity of rest, he would review the day, not the external events, the inner responses to the external events, not what happened, but how he met what happened, not the objective record of the day's activities, but the specific, honest, personally accountable examination of the person he had been within those activities. He asked himself 3 questions. He recommended them to his readers, with the insistence of someone who had discovered, through their consistent application, that they were not just useful, but transformative. Where did I go wrong today? Not in the self-flagellating sense of the person who uses the evening review as an occasion for the harsh inner critic that the Stoic framework consistently identifies as counterproductive, but in the honest, practically oriented sense of someone who wants to know specifically where the gap between aspiration and behavior was widest, where the Stoic principles failed to translate into Stoic practice, where the anger was felt before it was examined, where the distraction won when attention should have been guarded, where the fear was deferred to when courage was available. Where did I do well today? Because the evening review is not only the examination of failure, it is also the honest acknowledgement of genuine alignment. The moments when the dichotomy of control was genuinely applied and the equanimity it promises was genuinely experienced. The conversation that was handled with the care and the honesty that genuine relationship requires. The work that was done with the full, focused attention that genuine quality demands. These moments deserve acknowledgement, not for the purpose of self-congratulation, which the Stoic tradition consistently identifies as the vanity of someone who needs external validation even from themselves, but for the purpose of the genuine reinforcement of the behavior that produced them. The recognition that the philosophical practice worked, that it was possible, in that moment, to be the person it is aspiring to become, is itself one of the primary fuels of continued philosophical development. What can I do better tomorrow? Because the evening review is ultimately forward-looking. Its purpose is not the audit of the past for its own sake. It is the extraction, from the honest examination of the past, of the specific, practical, actionable instruction for the future. The identification of the specific moment that went wrong, the specific trigger, the specific habitual response, the specific circumstance in which the armor failed, and the deliberate, philosophically grounded preparation for the next encounter with the same circumstance. Marcus Aurelius practiced this evening review with the consistency that his journals reveal. The meditations, which were always private, never intended for publication, the raw and honest record of a philosophical life in genuine, daily, imperfect progress, are themselves the document of an evening review practice sustained across years. The entries that acknowledge failure are as common as the entries that articulate principle. The moments of genuine self-criticism, the recognition that the Emperor of Rome had, again, allowed impatience to govern a response that equanimity should have produced, are as frequent as the moments of philosophical clarity. And this is, in some ways, the most important thing that Marcus Aurelius's journals reveal about the Stoic daily practice. Not the principles, not the philosophical framework, but the consistency. The daily return to the examination, the refusal to conclude, after any single day of failure, that the project is impossible or the philosophy is insufficient. The patient, persistent, unglamorous, entirely undramatic commitment to the practice that is the only thing that actually produces genuine philosophical development over time. He also added a morning practice that deserves specific attention, because it is both among the most practically powerful and the most misunderstood of the Stoic disciplines: the practice of negative visualization, the deliberate, specific morning imagining of what could be lost, not as the anxious anticipation of feared futures, which is the anxiety that the earlier chapter identified as the misuse of the imagination, but as the philosophically grounded, gratitude-producing, presence-deepening practice of genuinely appreciating what is currently present by genuinely imagining its absence. The morning practice of imagining that you might not see the people you love again that day, not with the fear-colored urgency of someone who believes it likely, but with the philosophical openness of someone who acknowledges it as possible, changes the quality of the encounter when it actually happens. The irritation that would have governed the interaction with a family member, whose habits are familiar enough to be taken for granted, is replaced, not always, not perfectly, but with genuine frequency, by the specific quality of attention that the awareness of impermanence reliably produces. The attention that knows this person is finite, that this encounter is not guaranteed to recur, that the quality of presence brought to this specific, present, irreplaceable moment is the only thing that determines how fully the encounter is actually inhabited. This is the Stoic morning practice of memento mori, applied not to the abstract awareness of mortality, but to the specific, daily, interpersonal reality of the life actually being lived. The morning reminder that what is most valued is also most finite, and that the appropriate response to that finitude is not fear, but the specific, philosophically grounded, daily practice quality of genuine presence and genuine gratitude that the awareness of impermanence makes possible. The morning and evening disciplines together constitute what might be called the daily architecture of the Stoic life. The morning prepares, aligning the mind with the values and the principles that are meant to govern the day. The evening reviews, examining honestly the gap between the morning's intention and the day's actual behavior, extracting the specific learning that genuine development requires. And the day itself, the specific, ordinary, frequently demanding hours between the morning and the evening, is the arena in which the philosophy is either practiced or merely professed. These practices require nothing more than time and honesty. No special equipment, no particular expertise, no conditions other than the daily willingness to begin, imperfectly, persistently, with the patient commitment of someone who understands that genuine philosophical development is the work of years rather than the achievement of a moment. 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening. The specific, structural support of a daily practice that keeps the philosophical life genuinely alive, rather than gradually, imperceptibly, one skipped day at a time, allowing it to become the intellectual property of someone who once found it interesting, but no longer finds it necessary. Begin tonight with the first of Seneca's 3 questions. Where did I go wrong today? Ask it honestly, answer it specifically, and return to the work tomorrow. That is the Stoic daily practice. Nothing more, nothing less, and maintained consistently across months and years and the full arc of a genuinely examined life. Nothing short of transformative. Chapter 12. Becoming Unbreakable. We have arrived at the final chapter, and it begins with an honest acknowledgement. You will not become unbreakable. Not in the sense that the word might suggest on first encounter. Not in the sense of the person who has achieved such complete mastery of the Stoic philosophy that nothing touches them. That loss does not grieve them. That failure does not sting. That the full range of what a human life in a genuinely difficult world reliably produces. The disappointments, the betrayals, the accumulated small defeats and occasional large catastrophes of an actual life, actually lived, passes through them without leaving a mark. That person does not exist. The Stoics themselves said so. The perfectly wise person, the Stoic sage who has fully realized every principle of the philosophy with complete and permanent consistency, was acknowledged by the Stoics themselves to be a theoretical ideal, a direction rather than a destination, an aspiration that organizes the journey without describing the arrival. What you can become, what the entire arc of this book has been pointing toward, is something more honest and more genuinely available than that theoretical ideal. Something that does not require perfection. That does not demand the absence of fear, or the elimination of anger, or the complete dissolution of the attachment that makes loss painful. That does not ask you to become less human in order to become more philosophical. What it asks is simpler and more demanding than any of those things. It asks you to be the person who keeps returning to the morning practice when the morning is difficult and the resistance is strong, and the easier thing is to begin the day as it has always been begun, with the feed and the inbox and the habitual orientation toward the external world before the internal one has been attended to. To the evening review, when the day was ordinary enough that the examination seems unnecessary, and the tiredness is real, and the comfort of simply closing the day without examining it is genuinely appealing. To the dichotomy of control, when the thing outside your control is so genuinely important and so genuinely at risk that the instruction to release it feels not like philosophical wisdom, but like the abandonment of what matters most. To the practice of the examined life, when what the examination reveals is not what was hoped, when the honest look at the day's actual behavior produces not the confirmation of genuine progress, but the uncomfortable recognition of genuine failure. To the armor, when the armor has been dented, when the anxiety broke through it, when the anger expressed itself before the examination could begin, when the distraction won, when the courage was not available, when the relationship was managed rather than genuinely inhabited, when the money was given more importance than the philosophy clearly teaches it deserves. These are the moments that actually determine whether genuine Stoic development is occurring. Not the moments when the principles are applied easily, when the situation is not too provoking, the stakes not too high, the habitual self not too strongly activated. But the moments when everything in the conditioned, habituated, survival-organized nervous system is pulling in the direction of the automatic response, and the philosophical discipline, however imperfectly, however partially, however much less completely than the morning's intention promised, intervenes anyway. That intervention, small, invisible, frequently undervalued by the person making it, is the practice. The actual, real, meaningful practice. Not the morning reading, not the evening review, not the intellectual understanding of the dichotomy of control, or the premeditation of difficulties, or any of the specific Stoic tools that this book has attempted to make available. Those are the preparation. The practice is the moment of choice, the specific, lived, behaviorally expressed moment in the actual day when the choice is made, however imperfectly, to respond rather than react, to examine rather than accept, to return from wherever the habitual self has wandered, to the values that the philosophical life has identified as the genuine foundation. Marcus Aurelius failed at this regularly. The private journals that constitute the Meditations, the most honest document of the Stoic life that the tradition has produced, make this unmistakably clear. He was impatient when equanimity was called for. He was vain when humility was required. He was distracted when full presence was needed. He invested his peace in outcomes that the dichotomy of control clearly placed outside his domain. He allowed the anger to arrive before the examination could begin, and the next morning he returned to the practice. This is what the Meditations actually are. Not the triumphant record of a philosopher who has mastered the tradition, the imperfect, honest, daily record of a person who keeps returning, who fails and returns, who falls short and returns, who encounters, morning after morning and evening after evening, the same gap between aspiration and behavior, and narrows it incrementally and imperfectly, through the specific, humble, entirely undramatic act of continuing to try. This is what becoming unbreakable actually looks like. Not the absence of breakage, the practice of repair, not the immunity to defeat, the consistent, philosophically grounded capacity to meet defeat in its many forms, large and small, dramatic and mundane, without the specific additional suffering that the unexamined response to defeat reliably adds. The suffering of the loss, plus the suffering of the judgment that the loss represents something about your fundamental worth. The suffering of the failure, plus the suffering of the catastrophized story, that the failure confirms the feared inadequacy. The suffering of the difficult circumstance, plus the suffering of the resentment that the circumstance should have been different from what it is. This additional suffering, the suffering that the Stoic tradition identifies as the product of the false judgment, rather than the genuine difficulty, is what the armor is designed to address, not the primary suffering. The primary suffering is real. Loss is real. Failure is real. Difficulty is real. The Stoics never pretended otherwise, and this book has not pretended otherwise either. But the additional suffering, the layer that the unexamined mind adds to every genuine difficulty through its automatic, habitual, philosophically unexamined responses. This is the domain where the armor operates. where the genuine philosophical development that this book has been attempting to support makes the most immediately measurable difference. The person who loses something significant and grieves it genuinely, without the additional suffering of the story that the loss proves something about their fundamental unworthiness, is experiencing the genuine suffering that loss requires, and nothing more. The person who fails at something important and learns from it honestly, without the additional suffering of the catastrophized narrative that the failure confirms their deepest fears about themselves, is experiencing the genuine suffering that failure sometimes requires, and nothing more. This is not the elimination of suffering. It is its reduction to its genuine dimensions. The stripping away of the additional suffering that the unexamined, unphilosophical response to difficulty reliably adds, and the discovery that the genuine suffering, encountered directly and without the inflation of the unexamined mind, is almost always more survivable than the inflated version suggested. The Stoics also understood something about the relationship between individual philosophical development and collective human flourishing that the individualistic framing of most modern self-improvement ignores. The person who becomes genuinely more equanimous, who has done the genuine work of reducing their own additional suffering and developing the genuine stability of the examined life, does not keep that development to themselves. They bring it into every relationship, every professional encounter, every social context they inhabit. The person who does not catastrophize is the person in the room who can see clearly when everyone else is panicking. The person who does not react before examining is the person whose response to difficulty is genuinely useful, rather than merely emotionally expressive. The person who has genuinely released attachment to outcomes is the person who can make genuinely good decisions in situations where others' decisions are distorted by the desperate need for a specific result. These contributions, quiet, frequently invisible, never announced as philosophical achievement, are the specific ways in which genuine Stoic development serves not just the person doing it, but the people around them, the family members, the colleagues, the friends, the strangers encountered in the brief transactions of daily life, who receive from the genuinely developed Stoic a quality of presence and a quality of response that the undeveloped person cannot offer. Marcus Aurelius understood this as the primary justification for the philosophical project, not personal well-being, though the Stoic life produces genuine personal well-being as a byproduct of its genuine philosophical commitments. But the capacity to serve, to bring to the role of emperor or parent or colleague or friend or stranger the specific quality of character that genuine service requires, the equanimity that allows clear judgment under pressure, the honesty that places genuine communication above comfortable performance, the care for the other's actual well-being over the management of their positive perception, the courage to make the difficult decision when the easy one is available and wrong. These are not the achievements of a sage. They are the achievable, daily, imperfect, but genuine expressions of a philosophical life in progress, available to the person who keeps returning, who maintains the morning practice and the evening review, and the daily humble, unglamorous commitment to the specific, present, available improvement that genuine Stoic development always offers. There is a final image that the Stoic tradition offers for the unbreakable life, and it comes, as so much of the best Stoic imagery does, from Marcus Aurelius. He wrote about the rock in the ocean. The waves break against it. The storms assault it. The full force of the sea's power is directed, continuously and without relief, at this single, specific, fixed point. And the rock remains. Not unchanged, the sea shapes it, smooths it, gradually and imperceptibly alters its surface, but present, grounded, unmoved in its fundamental position by the force of whatever the ocean sends against it. This is the image of the Stoic life at its most developed, not the life that escapes the waves. There is no such life. Not the life that controls the ocean. There is no such power, but the life that has found, through the patient, daily, philosophically grounded practice of building what cannot be taken, the inner stability, the genuine character, the examined and authentic self, something that the waves can shape but cannot dissolve. The waves will come. They always come. The anxiety and the anger and the fear and the distraction and the difficult people and the unjust circumstances and the losses that no amount of philosophical preparation can prevent from being genuinely painful. All of it will come. It always has. It always will. The question that this book has been attempting to address, from the preface through the 12 chapters of a philosophy 2,000 years old and as urgently relevant as the morning's difficulty, is not whether the waves will come. It is what you will be made of when they do. The answer that the Stoic tradition offers, grounded in the specific, personal, genuinely tested experience of some of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived, is not a comfortable answer. It does not promise immunity. It does not offer the specific, guaranteed resolution that the anxious mind is always seeking. It does not tell you that if you practice correctly enough, long enough, with sufficient philosophical seriousness, the waves will stop. It tells you something better, something more honest, something that the genuine philosophical tradition has always understood, and that the genuine philosophical practitioners, the people who actually live these principles in the arena of real, demanding, genuinely difficult lives, have consistently demonstrated that what you are made of is not fixed at birth. It is built daily. In the morning practice and the evening review and the specific, present, available moment of genuine choice that each ordinary day reliably provides. That the armor is real, that it can be forged, that the process of forging it, imperfect, persistent, never finally complete, is itself one of the most genuinely meaningful activities available to a human life. That the inner citadel, the specific, philosophically grounded, daily practice stability of a self that has been genuinely examined, genuinely developed, and genuinely committed to the values that constitute the good life, is available to anyone, regardless of circumstance, regardless of history, regardless of the specific, personal, individual combination of difficulty and advantage that the particular life has provided. It is available to you, right now, in whatever condition the reading of this book finds you, with whatever philosophical development you have already achieved, and whatever distance remains between where you currently are and where the tradition is pointing. The journey is always from here. The armor is always forged in the present. The practice is always available in the next moment, however the previous moment was spent. Begin, return, continue. That is all the Stoic tradition has ever asked, and everything it has ever promised. Closing, a final letter to the reader. Dear reader, you have traveled a considerable distance in these pages. From the painted porch in Athens, where Zeno sat down after losing everything and decided that wisdom was worth more than what the shipwreck took. Through the private journals of an emperor who governed 60 million people and still found it necessary to remind himself each morning of the basics. Through the teachings of a man who owned nothing and understood freedom more completely than most people who have owned everything. Through the letters of a man whose wealth and eloquence and proximity to power never quite resolved the fundamental questions that the philosophical life kept returning him to. And through the specific, demanding, immediately applicable territory of the modern life that all of this ancient wisdom is being asked to illuminate. The anxiety that the modern world produces in quantities that no previous generation was required to manage. The anger that the information environment manufactures with such extraordinary efficiency. The fear that the pace of change and the scale of uncertainty make so understandable and so costly. The distraction that has become the default condition of a mind without the philosophical discipline to protect its own attention. The work and the relationships and the money and the daily practice that are, collectively, the actual arena in which the Stoic philosophy must be lived, rather than merely understood. I want to say something to you now that the formal structure of the preceding chapters did not quite provide the space to say. This is hard, not the philosophy. The philosophy, once understood, is clear. The dichotomy of control is one of the most elegant and most practically powerful frameworks ever articulated for the management of a human life. The primacy of virtue is a genuinely liberating reorientation of what the good life requires. The examined life is both the most honest and the most productive relationship with the self that genuine development allows. The morning and evening disciplines are as simple and as effective as any daily practice ever devised. What is hard is the living of it. The daily, imperfect, resistance meeting, habitual self-opposing, genuinely demanding practice of actually applying what the philosophy so clearly describes. In the morning when the resistance is strong. In the moment of genuine provocation, when the anger arrives before the examination can begin. In the relationship when the attachment is deep, and the instruction to hold with open hands feels like the abandonment of what matters most. In the work when the injustice is real, and the equanimity it requires feels less like philosophical wisdom and more like resignation. In all of these moments, the actual moments, the lived moments, the moments that constitute the genuine test of whether the philosophy has been absorbed or merely appreciated. The distance between understanding and practice is felt most acutely, and it is in that distance, in the honest, uncomfortable, frequently humbling experience of that distance, that genuine philosophical development actually occurs. Not in the reading, in the trying, in the failing, in the returning, in the accumulated, daily, unglamorous practice of attempting to close the gap between the person the philosophy is aspiring toward and the person the habitual self continues, with remarkable persistence, to be. Marcus Aurelius understood this. He wrote his meditations in that gap. Every entry is the document of someone who knows where they are trying to go and is honest enough to record where they actually are. The gap between those two things, maintained in honest view, returned to daily, neither inflated into despair nor minimized into complacency, is the specific territory of the genuine philosophical life. It is your territory now. The specific, personal, entirely particular version of the gap that your history and your temperament, and your specific combination of challenges and advantages has created. The specific distance between the person you are and the person you are trying to become. The specific, daily, available work of closing it, not completely, not permanently, but genuinely, incrementally, in the real and present and available moments of an actual human life. The Stoics do not ask for perfection. They never asked for perfection. What they asked for, what Zeno asked for and Epictetus demonstrated, and Marcus Aurelius practiced, and Seneca articulated, with such extraordinary eloquence, was the genuine attempt, the honest engagement, the daily return to the practice that is the only thing that produces genuine philosophical development over the arc of a genuinely examined life. They also offer something in return for that genuine attempt, not the promise of a life without difficulty, not the guarantee of outcomes, not the comfortable assurance that the waves will stop, or that the armor will never be tested, or that the practice, sufficiently sustained, will eventually produce the permanent equanimity that removes the need for further practice. They offer something more honest and more enduring than any of those things. The specific, daily, experientially grounded knowledge, built through the accumulated practice of the morning disciplines and the evening reviews and the moments of genuine choice in the actual days of an actual life, that you are capable of more than the habitual self suggests, that the fear that presents itself as permanent is navigable, that the anger that presents itself as irresistible can be examined before it is expressed, that the anxiety that presents itself as the only honest response to genuine uncertainty can be met with the specific, philosophically grounded equanimity that the practice of the dichotomy of control, sustained over time, actually produces, that the inner citadel, that specific, personal, genuinely built stability that no external circumstance can enter without permission, is real, that it can be constructed, that it is being constructed, however imperfectly, in every moment of genuine philosophical engagement with the actual life that is actually available to be lived. I want to close with something that Marcus Aurelius wrote in the final years of his life, not as a triumphant summary of philosophical achievement, as the honest, quietly powerful statement of someone who had spent a lifetime in genuine philosophical practice and who understood, better than most, both what that practice had produced and what it had not. He wrote about the present moment, about the specific, immediate, available reality of this moment, not the remembered past or the anticipated future, but the actual present, as the only domain in which genuine living is possible, the only domain in which genuine choice is available, the only domain in which the practice can be practiced, and the armor can be worn, and the examined life can be genuinely lived. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not because the past is irrelevant, not because the future does not matter, but because the present is where you are, and where you are is where the practice is available, where the choice is real, where the philosophical life, however imperfectly, however incompletely, however much remains between the aspiration and its full expression, is actually being lived. You are here. The philosophy is here. The practice is available. The waves will come. They always come. The chaos of the modern world, its speed and its noise and its manufactured urgency, and its genuine complexity, and its actual, undeniable, sometimes overwhelming difficulty, will continue to present itself as the argument against the possibility of the equanimity that the Stoic tradition has been describing across these pages. It is not an argument against. It is the argument for. The ancient mental armor was not forged in comfortable conditions. It was forged in exactly the conditions that surround you, in the uncertainty and the difficulty and the genuine complexity of a world that does not reliably cooperate with human preferences. By people who had every reason to abandon the philosophical project in favor of the easier alternatives, the distraction, the resentment, the resignation, the accumulated bitterness of someone who has decided that the world's difficulty is the appropriate excuse for the abandonment of genuine aspiration. They did not abandon it. Morning after morning, evening after evening, in the public arena of an empire and the private arena of a slave's cell, and the literary arena of letters written to friends across the width of the Roman world, they returned to the practice. They left us the record of that returning, the extraordinary, imperfect, genuinely human record of people who tried, who failed, who returned, who built through that returning, something that 2,000 years of history have not managed to make obsolete. That record is yours now. The philosophy is yours. The practice is yours. The specific, daily, available, imperfect, genuinely transformative work of building the inner citadel, in your life, with your history, in your circumstances, with your particular combination of the armor already forged and the work still remaining, is yours. Begin, return, continue. The ancients are with you. For more timeless books and book summaries on spiritual growth, psychology, self-improvement, and the art of living wisely, subscribe to MindShelf on YouTube and keep expanding your inner library of wisdom. Grow in awareness. Live in balance. This is MindShelf.